We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us for our first ever virtual UVA Diversifying Psychology Visit Day. We have certainly, this is not our first Diversifying Psychology Visit Day, but it is our first time doing this virtually. We were scheduled to do it in person in the spring, and unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we're not able to. Thought maybe we'd bring people here in the fall. Really underestimated what we were getting ourselves into. And so, yes, are happy to be able to bring this to you all virtually. And then also, we are recording this and we are working on closed captioning and kind of accessibility issues. And then we'll be subsequently posting this on our department website so that you can come back and look at it and maybe share it with other folks. And we'll be kind of disseminating it more broadly because we're hoping that the information we share, which is both about applying to graduate school, but also about the experience of being a graduate student and obviously some information specific to our UVA Psych department, will be accessible going forward. And so as much as we're trying to capitalize on the unique opportunity of today, we also do want this to be something that we can share more broadly. So I am going to first turn it over to Dr. Alev Ersir, who's our chair of the psychology department, so that she can introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our department's virtual space. I'm so glad that you're here. My name is Alev Ersir. I'm a professor in the behavioral neuroscience area, and I'm lucky to be the department chair of this wonderful department. So in that capacity, I have this opportunity to welcome you and say a few words. I'm not going to take a lot of time. I know there's a full program with lots of useful information ahead of you. I only want to leave you with these 2 bits of sound bites. The first sound bite is this: the human connections are the roots of resilience. The human connections are the roots of resilience. We are living through very challenging times. I don't have to tell you this, and I'm not even attempt to give you a list. But what I would like to impress upon you is that the better connected we are, the better chance we have to come up on top, and that all of this. So keep us in your connections. Know that we are here to support you and help you with your graduate school journey. And this is an open invitation, really, which I hope you will remember even after you earn your PhD and set your own path. And this way, I hope we can keep each other resilient. And the second piece of soundbite is also this: keep an eye on us. Keep an eye on the graduate programs that are offered in our department. Keep an eye on our community of faculty and graduate students. And when you do that, I hope you will find a few things that will speak to you. And I hope that we will get a chance to talk to each other again and under a different context as well and soon. So I will stop here and turn my little rectangle to Professor Hurd now. And I hope you enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all of your support, always with putting together these very important opportunities for students to get to know more about us and our department and all of the wonderful things we have to offer. I'm now going to turn it over briefly to Alexis Stanton, who's going to tell you, introduce herself and tell you a little bit more about herself, and then she'll hand it back off to me.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Alexis Stanton, and I'm a 3rd-year graduate student in the community psychology program. I work with Dr. Lanice Avery in the RISE lab. If you haven't heard of it or you haven't met with her already today, please look it up. She's amazing. I also serve as the graduate student director of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the psychology department. So I mostly work with Dr. Noelle Hurd to put on events like this, and also just to sort of move forward our DE&I initiatives in the department. So we're really excited to have you here. I'm going to turn it back over to Noelle so we can get started.
Thank you. And Alexis, you can see me, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
it like doesn't show me myself, which is fine.
Same.
I also just wanted to make sure that as we were recording, there wasn't this like ghostly voice, but you didn't have the image. So, and I met with several of you already earlier. So nice to reconnect, and also just want to welcome the folks I didn't get a chance to connect with, and thank you for taking time out of your Friday afternoon to learn a little bit more about our program and what we have to offer. So as Alexis mentioned, I'm faculty in the clinical and community programs here at UVA. Alexis and I do a lot of work in the department around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also, I have a DDI, that's Director of Diversity and Inclusion in the department, and that's Bethany Teachman, and she's also a faculty member in the clinical area. And so the three of us kind of lead and champion a lot of initiatives within the department. You will hear later this afternoon into the early evening from Alexis and Janelle, who are going to talk more about the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that we have going on in the department. And I hope from that you'll also get a chance to learn how students are very active and involved in a lot of the work we do. So while Alexis, Bethany, and I are largely organizing and supporting a lot of the efforts, we certainly do have a lot of participation throughout the department, especially with very strong graduate school student leadership and participation. I'm not going to take up a lot of your time here because I want to make sure we start the panel on time at 3:30, but I just wanted to give you a brief overview. One, I wanted to tell you that our department has 7 areas or kind of doctoral programs. You may already be familiar. I know some of you have already identified program of study that's the best fit for you. For those who haven't had a chance to look yet, we do have programs in the following 7 areas. We have clinical, as I've already mentioned, and community, which Alexis and I are part of. We also have cognitive, developmental, quantitative, social, and then systems and behavioral neuroscience. Those are our 7 areas. Typically, students apply to just one of those programs, but as I've told students earlier today, we do have a very collaborative department, and so there are opportunities for students to be involved in multiple research labs. Oftentimes that happens within one area, but it also does happen not infrequently across areas, and so that's just an opportunity for you as well. Today, we are fortunate that you will be hearing from graduate students from across these various areas and programs, also students who will be at different stages in their doctoral degree. And so it'll be a great opportunity for you to get multiple perspectives, even though we are one department. I think we are very diverse in terms of our interests and experiences, and you'll get a sense of that today from the students who will be presenting. Our first panel will run from 3:30 to 4:30. It will focus on the grad admission process, so it will actually be pretty instructive. You'll hear from grad students about how to develop application materials and how to otherwise prepare for and navigate the grad application and admission process. We will then follow that hour with a 30-minute Q&A period. Then at 5 p.m., our second panel will begin. This panel will focus on selecting the right graduate program for you. So the panelists will discuss student life issues, some of the ongoing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives we are advancing in our department, and then this will be followed by an additional 30-minute Q&A period. So I want to give you just a little instruction about the Q&A feature. I don't know how many of you have used the webinars through Zoom, but you should all be seeing in your Zoom screen Q&A icon at the bottom. This is something all attendees should be able to see. We're going to ask you to submit your questions using this feature, and you can do this throughout the presentation. So luckily, Alexis and I have teamed up to moderate these panels, and we will be monitoring the Q&A throughout. And so I will collect those questions, and even though we're not going to interrupt the presenters, We're going to allow the presentations to kind of move forward so we can stay on time. I will have all of those questions collected so that I can feed them to the panelists during the Q&A period. You can either submit questions during a presentation, and I will queue that up when we get to the Q&A period, or you can submit additional questions during the Q&A session. So again, we will do our best to get through all of the questions that are provided, or if we can't during our time allotted, we will follow up. You can submit questions anonymously if you prefer. And you can indicate if it's a question for all the panelists or one panelist in particular. So we will stay on top of that and make sure that you have a chance to get your specific questions answered. Again, those will be in 30-minute sessions at the end of each hour-long panel. So with that said, we are close to starting time, and I wanted to make sure that we stayed on schedule. So I think at this point we can turn it over to our very first panelist. And again, this is the panel that is focused mostly on the admissions process. And that is Ilana Lattis. So I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Hi, everyone. I have been having some internet connectivity issues, so I apologize if my video cuts out at any point. Hopefully that won't happen. I'm Ilana Lattis. I'm a second-year clinical psychology student here at UVA. And I'm going to be talking about how to put a CV together for grad school admissions. There we go. Okay, so CV literally translates into the course of one's life, and that's exactly what it is in terms of your academic life. A CV is the academic version of a resume, and it can really include all your educational experiences, any research experience you've had, any scholarly works that you've done, things like publications, if you've had the chance to work on any posters, anything at all like that, any academic awards or honors that you've won. And you can also put special skills. Some people have, can speak like more than one language or have special coding or stat skills or things like that, among many others. Yeah, so. There we go. Okay, and so some of you may have prepared a CV in the past, or sorry, prepared things like that. Oh, I think. Sorry, I think my connection may be cutting out. But yeah, so okay, so some suggested sections you can include on your CV are the ones listed here. I would definitely include your contact information. You want to make sure you have like a nice, I'm seeing that my slides are advancing. I'm not clicking on the slides. Sorry about that, everyone. That's okay. I can just keep chatting about the CV stuff without my slides. Yeah, so yeah, important sections to include on a CV include the contact information, education experience that you've had, any honors or awards. Research experience is really important. If you've had that so far, that's great. I would make sure to put that up close and center, so that's really clear to anyone reading your CV. Any publications that you've had the chance to work on, that's also great. Any community service that you've done is wonderful to include as well. Skills that are relevant to grad school and things like that. Is someone advancing the slide? That's okay. I can just kind of go. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So sometimes you'll include references on your CV. I would say that tends to be more optional, but some people like to do that. Some people put relevant coursework on their CV. I think if there's, you know, coursework that you've done that's relevant to the program you're applying to or to the lab you're applying to, that can be really nice to highlight, but generally isn't required. And again, like any sorts of relevant trainings or certifications you've done. And sometimes people have teaching experience before they even get to grad school, which is great to highlight, especially since you'll probably be doing some form of teaching in grad school. Let's see. There it is. Okay, I'm gonna see if I can actually double back quickly. Yeah, so one more point I wanted to add from this slide is that the CV, this is not the time for you to be super modest. You know, you should be truthful in everything you write, but also, you know, you've worked so hard to get to the point that you are. And, you know, this is really the place to let your achievements shine and showcase who you are and what you've done. To your prospective mentor, to the admissions committee. So don't feel shy about, you know, like talking about what you've done. That's really important. Okay. Okay, and so one thing, let me just check my time. Okay, so yeah, so one thing I want to make sure that you can take away from this workshop is how to describe a research experience, because that's, especially when you're applying to graduate school, that's something that advisors will be looking for. They really want to see what you've done, but also like how you talk about it, because that can be really telling as well. So I have two different examples of ways you can phrase the same idea on your CV. This was actually taken from the CV I used when applying to graduate school. So here you have develop and implement organizational systems for study data, measures, and training materials. And then this other, it's kind of the same idea, but said a little differently. You have was responsible for organizing parts of the study. So I think that the first example is one that I would recommend using something like this. It uses action verbs, so you see the word develop and implement, and that kind of gives you an idea as a reader, like, oh, okay, that's what this person was doing in that role. And it's like pretty specific and also active. Oh no! I'm not sure what happened to those slides again. Okay, they got away. Okay, and so then in the second example here, we have, you know, it's a little bit more passively worded. Generally, you want to start with that action verb. So you developed, you streamlined, you analyzed. So, you know, this is not quite as strong as the first bullet. It's a little bit more vague. Oh yeah. Okay, I see that somebody asked if I could repeat something. Sorry, I just
Alana, I don't know if you can hear me, but it does seem like your audio, it cut out a couple times and again just now for about 30 seconds.
Oh boy, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. I'll try to finish up quickly while I still have connectivity. So yeah, so to make this a little bit more concrete, I wanted to give
Alana, maybe try turning off your video, and then let's see if that, can you hear me, Alana? It does keep, your audio does keep cutting out, but I wonder if you turn off the video and try and talk us through it, maybe that'll free up a little bit of the broadband that you have there.
Hi everyone, can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm so sorry, I'm basically done. Can anyone see the examples of the action verbs?
Mhm.
Okay, great. So yeah, so I just wanted to leave you with some like concrete words you can use. There's lots of great sample CVs online, but yeah, one really important takeaway is to like make sure you're really characterizing your research experience and other experiences well, and that you're really kind of giving yourself, you know, you're really selling yourself and your experiences. I'm so sorry I cut out. I'm going to try to switch computers. So for the Q&A, I can answer more questions. And I also just wanted to leave you with my email address. You're welcome to reach out to me if you have questions about the application process, about putting together a CV or anything like that. Thank you so much. Sorry again for the Wi-Fi issues.
Thank you, Alana. And I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure. Alexis and I are communicating and we are not advancing the slides. So I'm sorry that you had to navigate.
It was like a ghost.
It does seem like the technology demons are trying to sabotage us, but we are going to persevere. And thank you so much. And yeah, if you want to switch to another device or your phone or anything that might, help facilitate the connection for the Q&A, that would be great. But thank you, and also sorry for the challenges. And next up, I'll go ahead and cue us up while I'm talking. We have Corey, who is going to cover the personal statement as another important element of the application process.
Hi, yes, I'm Corey. I'm a second-year clinical psychology grad student here at UVA. And yeah, I want to talk to you guys about the personal statement. I will say sort of in this topic, I think there are probably fewer sort of hard and fast rules. So I've just kind of assembled a lot of the advice and kind of, I think, good tips, but I think there probably is a lot of sort of heterogeneity in what these look like. I will say there's some great resources that I definitely use when working on my personal statement. One I have here is Mitch Prinstein's Uncensored Advice for Applying to Grad School in Clinical Psychology. This is obviously for clinical psych, but I think a lot of really good tips. And another one, which I didn't put here, but I can share, is the it's like Clinical Psychology Kiss of Death for applications. So both of those are definitely resources that I used, and a lot of the information in this presentation is then kind of informed from that. So just some really general kind of overview of what these personal statements look like. They're typically about 1 page, but definitely look for each program because there tends to be guidelines on sort of word limit. And sort of broad strokes, you're trying to demonstrate kind of your preparedness for grad school and then your fit within sort of a given lab. And so you're going to spend the bulk of the personal statement kind of detailing your relevant research background and kind of tying that to the program that you're applying to, sort of demonstrating that through this research background, you are now prepared and kind of have been, this experience has kind of informed your thinking so that you will be a good fit for the program you're applying to. Usually you're submitting at least like one personal statement like this, but again, check the requirements because sometimes there are additional essays or some programs will ask for an essay detailing more like your experience overcoming adversity or sort of your relationship with diversity issues, things like that. So that varies program to program, and a good idea to check those early so you're kind of giving yourself time to work on those things. My advice for sort of tackling the personal statement would be, I think it is really helpful to have clear in your head kind of how you're going to be describing your research interests. So trying to get that in a few sentences. And I think trying to find the balance between being sort of too general and too specific with kind of how you're selling yourself. I had an example. So, and this is just sort of like in my area of interest, but so if I was sort of selling myself as interested in couples, I think that would be too broad. But I think like a better example is someone I know sold themselves as, I'm interested in exploring the ways macro level stressors like discrimination and neighborhood violence impact couple functioning. So sort of taking maybe a broad area of interest and kind of narrowing it down a little bit or kind of customizing it a little bit so that you can sort of sell, I think, sort of your critical thinking, and that maybe you're going to bring sort of a unique perspective to a given lab. So I would try and start with kind of feeling clear about what your research interests are. And then you're gonna sort of, the task with the personal statement is kind of bringing the CV to life. So you really want to help the reader kind of read between the lines of your CV. So you might start with kind of detailing a research experience, like, you know, about how you worked in a certain lab, but you want to connect that experience to both sort of the skills you developed through that experience and also sort of how that experience shapes your research thinking. And so skills, yeah, and I want to talk about both of these categories a little bit more in detail because I think they're both really important. With the skills, I think you both want to demonstrate kind of general research preparedness stuff. So things like that you've, you know, learned how to run protocols. Definitely any experience with sort of research dissemination is really important. And then also sort of any unique experiences, if you've been exposed to sort of specific methods that are unique or again might be particularly relevant to the professor you're applying to. Definitely highlighting that. And yeah, with skills, you definitely want to put your best foot forward. So thinking about kind of like what are your coolest and kind of most maybe robust, interesting skills that you've developed and trying to sell that a little bit. But then also I think really what takes these statements to the next level is sort of demonstrating this research thinking so that showing that you have sort of learned how to kind of develop novel research hypotheses and that you're generally kind of like a curious, inquisitive scholar to be, and that the experiences that you have helped further sort of your thinking. So I think that there are a couple ways you can kind of insert your research thinking into these statements. And so I just want to give you a couple of examples. I think, do I have this on the next slide? Okay, well, I'll just talk and then we can talk about this example. But so one way to do it would be to kind of lay out your general research sentence interests and then kind of add specific questions after that. And so you could make kind of a paragraph that's like, this is my research thinking. I think a better way to do it is to sort of try and pepper your statement with your research thinking. So sort of like, this example, so if you're writing like I coded and entered data using SPSS on a project examining autism, that's sort of detailing your experience, but then sort of like from that process, you observe that children's intellectual ability notably changed presentation of PDD symptoms, leading to strong interest in studying Asperger's disorder. So sort of that the research experience, then like from having that experience, you took in that information and kind of use that to, you know, develop novel, interesting research questions. And I also think you can insert some of your research thinking when talking about the program of interest. So you can sort of detail, or the professor of interest. So you can say, I'm applying to blah, blah, blah's lab. They are studying this. I would be curious to study this, or sort of demonstrate your ability to think kind of within the constructs that your professor of interest is studying. But yeah, I think I cannot highlight enough, I guess, how I think this is really what brings these statements to life, is just demonstrating your critical thinking. And I think it communicates sort of fit with the professor and readiness for grad school, and kind of all the good things they're looking for in these personal statements is really comes through this research thinking. Customizing for each school. So I think it's normal to have a little bit of flexibility in kind of your research interests, where you can kind of fit within several different labs. And so I do think you want to tailor these statements to really fit the different labs that you're applying to. I mean, when you're applying to a program, you're trying to convince them that you are a great fit for that program specifically. So you definitely want to show that you've like done your homework about the program, and that you can kind of reference details of, I think, what I mainly talked about, like what the professors I was interested in are studying. But yeah, definitely referencing kind of the school and the professor and some sort of what it is they're studying. I think you can keep a lot of your specific research experience the same, unless the places you're applying to are vastly different, and you can kind of sub things out. But I do think you can kind of tailor your takeaways from the different projects, or if you're, demonstrating kind of some questions of interest, you can sort of tailor those to the professors you're applying to. Okay. The last thing, I just wanted to give a few tips that I think are important. I think you want to kind of toe the line between expressing kind of research interests that fit what the professor is studying, but also I think it's not as impressive to just literally say, I want to study exactly what this professor is doing. So trying to kind of bring in a little bit of, I think, yourself, or just yeah, I think it's okay to like deviate a little bit from literally what the professor you're applying to is studying. A good tip that I got, which I think is helpful, is you can look at what the grad students in a lab are studying. And so some labs, I think there's more sort of variability in the different projects grad students are doing, versus other labs, grad students will all work on like one project, for example. So that can give you a good sense of like how much you can deviate. Particularly with clinical psych, but also I think generally personal statements are not a place to really talk about sort of your own experience with mental health. So I think that can be sort of a misconception about people, or that people have, that you're sort of discussing your own mental health, and that I think can be more of a red flag than a positive in this space. And the last thing I'll just say is that I think you do definitely want to sell yourself and kind of tailor the statements to the people you're applying to, but also grad school lasts a long time, and you're not really doing yourself any favors by being dishonest about what you're interested in. So I think by taking these statements to really be as honest as possible in your research interests is helpful in finding the right program for you. All right.
Thanks, Corey. So next up, we have Zoe, who's going to talk to us about the process of securing letters of recommendation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zoe. As Noel said, I am a second-year PhD student in the developmental psychology area. I study with Vikram Jaswal in the Jaswal Lab, and we are particularly focused on autism and kind of the social relationships of autistic people. So just as a side note, if that's something you're interested in, or if you're interested in developmental psychology, I'm super happy to talk about that later, or you can email me with questions. But yeah, for the purposes of this panel, I wanted to talk some about letters of recommendation. Yep, and just generally to give you an overview, wanted to talk about what the purpose of letters of recommendation are, who to ask, when to ask for letters of recommendation and how to go about asking for them. And I just have some kind of brief comments, and definitely if you have questions about this at the end or while I'm talking, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we're happy to talk more about them in the panel. But just as an overview of why schools ask for letters of recommendation for graduate school applications. Even though you are submitting your CV and personal statements like Alana and Corey just talked about, and you're describing your experiences and what you've learned from them and the skills that you have, it's really helpful to have people who can speak to those things, because you can put your best foot forward in those applications, but it goes a long way to have other people in your life who can say those same things about you as well, and speak really positively and basically confirm that you have like the skills and the abilities that you're talking about in your other application materials. So ideally, and we'll get to this a little bit in kind of the who, but these should be people who have some kind of connections to you and the kinds of things that you're talking about in other parts of your application, so it all fits together. And you're presenting kind of like a coherent like story for the people who are going to be ultimately reviewing your application. Yeah, and these should be people who can speak to your ability to succeed in grad school. So I'm sure you have lots of people who love you, like family and friends and people that you've spent time with in different arenas, and who would be happy to say really great things about you and could give great character references. But the people for writing letters of recommendation should specifically be able to speak to the kinds of skills that are necessary to succeed in graduate school. So the people you might ask to write letters of recommendation are people who know you well and can give you specifics, can talk about specifics about why you would be a great fit for this program. That can include research advisors, so someone that you've worked with in a research lab or has overseen your undergraduate honors thesis if you've done one of those, and can talk specifically about the things that you worked on in those projects and the personal qualities that you showed throughout those projects. And then also professors can be good people to ask, specifically if you've been active in their class, because if you're asking a professor for a recommendation letter, but it was a class of 300 and you weren't really asking questions, or you didn't get a chance to meet them in office hours or something, they're not going to be able to give really great specifics about why you're such a great student. So if there's professors that you've been able to develop more of a relationship with, or have kind of in smaller classes, they're going to be able to write stronger letters of recommendation. Even if someone who doesn't know you that well is willing, they're not going to have as many specifics to go off of. And oftentimes it's good to ask for letters of recommendation from people who know you in an academic environment, because they're in a better position to speak to the kinds of skills that you'll need in graduate school. But especially if you're applying to more clinical programs, it can be good to have people who can speak to your clinical and professional skills as well. Like if you've done more kind of clinical or like work internships or experiences, and there's people who can talk about how you've done in those environments, that would also be helpful for this kind of application. As far as when to ask, I wanted to throw in a side note and say that if you're applying this cycle and you haven't reached out for letters of recommendation yet, you're still okay, you still have time. But if you're thinking about applying next year, it's good to aim to ask for letters of recommendation sometime in October, which should hopefully give you time to write at least a first draft of your personal statement and send that on to recommenders when you ask. And also gives them time to write the letter. So anyone that you're asking to write a recommendation letter for you is going to be doing it as a favor, and they're probably busy with other things to be doing as well. So the more time that you give them in advance, the more likely they are to be able to work it into their schedule and to tell you, yes, I can write this letter. And I also wanted to throw in, if you're thinking about for example, doing a gap year or working for a while, or you're not totally sure if you want to go to grad school right away and you're thinking about applying a little bit down the road, it's still a good idea to ask for some letters of recommendation before you graduate while you're actively involved with professors or the people that you're doing research with, because honestly, you'll be fresher in their minds and they'll be able to write more specific recommendation letters about more specifics about you. And then later, if they've already had that letter written, it'll be easier for them to tailor it a little bit to the kinds of programs you're applying to. Whereas it might be harder to write a letter from scratch a year after the last time that they've talked to you. And even if they have a great relationship with you and they really love you and, you know, you've like worked well together and you've made a good impression on them, it might be harder for them to call back specifics after some time has passed. So if you're thinking about waiting or you're not entirely sure if you're going to apply, it doesn't hurt to go ahead and ask for some letters of recommendation ahead of time just to have those ready to reach out later. And as far as how to ask, when we're in person, it's great to stop in someone's office. Obviously, these days, if you can stop by a professor or research advisors' office hours and meet over Zoom and ask in person, that's great. But at least sending a personalized email asking for the recommendation and reminding them of how you're connected. So if you had class a couple semesters ago, just say like what class it was and when you were in their class, and when you make the request, it's good to include information for them that will be helpful when they are writing your letter. So that includes information about the school and the programs that you're applying to, and if they have any specific requirements for letters of recommendation or just generally for the application, it's good to include some information about that. It's good to send along a copy of your personal statement and your CV as well as your transcript. For information for them to look over and potentially jog their memory and give them some specifics to talk about in their letter. And also for them to see kind of how you're marketing yourself. Because if they have like a few different experiences with you, or you've worked with them in research and then they see kind of how you're framing yourself to the program, they can kind of pick up on that and write your letter accordingly in a way that'll be more tailored to the kinds of programs you're applying to. And in that first email, it's good to let them know when these letters are due, whether it's the same day that the application is due or later. It's good to give them that date and then keep in front of them with that date and keep reminding them and following up and asking if they have had a chance to submit if you don't like automatically get notifications until those letters are due, because ultimately it is your responsibility to make sure that letters of recommendation get submitted. And it helps people out a lot if you give them reminders, because honestly, sometimes things get kind of buried in the inbox or people get busy with other things they're working on. And don't just assume that if you ask once and it's due in like a month or two that they'll necessarily remember and get it in. Because some people might and some people are very conscientious, but some people need that extra push. And so it doesn't hurt to follow up and also offer specifics. Like if they offer to give ideas about what they can talk about in the letter of recommendation, and a lot of people find that really helpful. So you can even include that in your first kind of email. Say, I'd love if you would talk about like this specific thing that we did together, or kind of how you saw these skills in me. I recently have gone through an application process where I had to ask for letters of recommendation, and one of the recommenders got back to me and said that it was super helpful that I gave some specific things about what the program was looking for, how I approached that in my statement, and ideas of what he could talk about, and said that it was much more helpful than requests where it was just kind of like, hey, can you write me a recommendation? So the more specific you can be, the better. And lastly, once the letters are submitted and after the deadline has passed, don't forget to send thank yous to these people who have taken their time to write you recommendation letters. And also, if they're writing you a recommendation letter, they've probably influenced your life in other ways too. And so it's a good opportunity to express your appreciation for them, and like a little thank you note or something. And that's just kind of a small thing to remember. But basically, that's all I had about letters of recommendation. And again, I'm super happy to answer any questions about that, or other things in the panel later. But
That was great, Zoe. Thanks so much. And I can definitely co-sign what you said in terms of the professor perspective, which is sometimes students don't always realize that professors are often getting these requests from many different students, undergrad, grad, students who might be applying for jobs. And it seems like they're all due right around the same time. And so anything you can do, which would be all of the advice that we gave you to make the letter writing process easier for the faculty you're requesting letters from, will certainly help. Will help them write a better letter for you, will help them to stay organized and make sure your letters get submitted. And so those are just really great tips to help not just make sure your applications are as strong as possible, but to kind of help us as professors be able to help you, which is what we want to do, but just understand sometimes we do get a little overwhelmed. And so anything you can do to make that easier is amazing. So next up we have Ariana, who's going to talk more about research experiences and kind of how to collect those and also how to package and present those when you're applying.
All right, hello everyone. So my name is Ariana Rivens. I'm gonna click and test. There we are. So my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today about research experience. So just a little bit about me. So I went to undergrad, Go Heels, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And while there, I was in a few research labs and I was in the Ronald E. McNair program, which is a program really geared towards getting folks into graduate school, getting PhDs. And I mentioned that because through that process, I had a lot of graduate school prep. I did a research project. So when we get to the panel section, if you have any questions related to those experiences, that's also the lens I'm coming in with, but know that your journey is just as important. And you can totally get to grad school, but for mine, I applied when I was in my senior year and I ended up here at the University of Virginia working with Dr. Noel Hurd. So I'm a third year student, a third year clinical psych student, if I didn't already say that. And so my program is research and clinical training. But let's dive into the different types of research experiences. So one I would say is the most common is as an undergraduate being a research assistant, either in a work study capacity. So that's where I got my first research experience. It was part of my financial aid package. It was a job I could do. I worked in a psychiatry lab, but it's also really common for students to be in these roles for course credit, which I highly recommend doing if possible. So you're able to get something while you're also gaining research experience and skills. You can also be a volunteer in labs, just depending on your availability. That's something that I did over the summers while also holding another job, which I think lots of people can attest to and understand. Something related to these undergraduate roles is doing an honors thesis. I highly recommend doing that if it's something that's available to you at your university or college, because it not only exposes you to the research process, which is key to see if you even like it and want to do it. It's very okay if the answer is no, you don't. But that gives you the chance to also do what Corey mentioned, and I'll be talking a little bit more about later, to do the scientific process to see if you like generating questions and analyzing data and writing it up, doing a literature review. There are also summer research experiences at your institution, if your institution doesn't have things like that at others, that people from the outside can come in. One that UVA is a part of is a Leadership Alliance program. So I know at least for the past 3 years I've been here, we've had students who've been part of the psychology department for a summer. Please correct me, but I think it's about 8 weeks that they come and do research assistant work, like I've already described, but also come up with their own research project and write it up and present that work at a conference, at the Leadership Alliance conference. So I really recommend checking out things like that. They're available at the undergraduate level and I think the post-bac level too, but I looped them in here because I think they're really aimed at doing exactly that, trying to expose people, get them grad school application prep. So the last bullet point is conference presentations and publications. That's usually a result of the research experiences that you've had. So you typically have to be involved in a lab in some capacity to have the chance to present at like your university level, at a regional level or national. But I do recommend, if it's possible, and really feel confident speaking up and saying, you know, I really want to get experience. I want to see if that's something I want to do. Communicating our science is also part of the research process. So getting involved on those things would be great too. At the postgraduate level or post-bac, you can have a full or part-time position doing research. So you could be a manager of a research lab, you could coordinate a project at a research institution or a hospital or things like that, be a project manager. I think there are folks on the panel now who can speak to that experience as well. You can also be a research assistant. Again, you could balance between that and another employment opportunity or it's paid. And again, they can turn into conference presentations or publications. So why get it? So I think I've already hit the nail on the head of like, get exposed, figure out if you're interested in like doing research and being a part of this process, not just data collection, right? Not just writing it up, but kind of all parts of it, because that's what your training will be focused on in graduate school. It's also really useful to be exposed to like different research topics so you can identify your own research program or questions that you may be interested in, which is really important. I think Corey made this point too, to be able to communicate concisely and clearly in your personal statement. Something that, so you'll see in the bottom corner, this is taken from a guide that I think Corey also named, but just also understanding like why we do research, how does it get funded, how does it get disseminated, what are the, where along in the process might your lab be in terms of like, are you just doing data collection, are you just cleaning the data? Like asking those questions, I think really help you understand it a little bit more and kind of well position you to speak to the skills that you have. Things to consider. This is something I thought about a lot, but like there's lots of different paths that people take in terms of their research experiences, in terms of getting to grad school in general. So for some people, it's really linear. Like they might be in a lab that focuses on memory for their first research experience. They find something within that they love and they just continue on that path. But others, like myself, it might be a little bit more of a zigzag. Like you kind of take the opportunities that you have and through that you're like, I like this research thing, but my interests, for whatever reason, I don't have the opportunity to go and do my dream project, or like, I don't even know what I'm interested in yet. So I'm just trying to get experience to see if I like research. Like that's understandable. I think faculty and graduate programs recognize that not everybody has, or not those, your perfect ideal experience is not accessible to every person. So it's really important to emphasize like the skills you learn to show that you have the capacity to be a great graduate student. You've thought about things that you want to study in your time. I also wanted to make a small mention. So this is not my area of expertise, but if there are like technical skills that you're interested in, I think of like neuroimaging techniques like functional MRI. I recommend getting experience if possible in those technical and those methodologies just to see again if you like it. So also so you can have something to speak to in your application. So you can say, even if you didn't get to run a study, because I know that that can be pretty technical, even having exposure to the data, that type of data that might result from that can be really helpful. And when I consulted with my friend who's a graduate student who does work like this, she was saying like, and if that's not accessible for the reasons we already mentioned, look at like foundational tutorials online, see if there are books in libraries near you can check out, read research articles. Like that doesn't mean, if you don't have experience, doesn't mean that you can't apply or that you'll be counted out, but also make the effort to learn as much as you can. So where do they go in their application? So we've already talked a bit about the CV, but that's where you list pretty clearly your research experiences that you've had, your presentations, your publications, letters of rec. I think Zoe did a great job already covering, you know, why you would want faculty and other people related to your research experiences to write them. I just wanted to make the point in my little soapbox that, you know, lots of people may contribute to the content of these letters. So faculty are writing them, and of course, highly recommend connecting with them, but you might see a project coordinator on the day-to-day or a graduate student on the day-to-day. So communicating those things to them can also be really helpful. Going back to personal and research statements, really repeating what Corey said, but really emphasizing the skills that you gained from an experience. Something that was helpful for me at this stage was like, as I was doing research work, like writing down, kind of logging, what did I do this? I reviewed abstracts for meta-analysis. I like entered in data. I put up flyers for participant recruitment, just so you know what you did. And then you can really hone on ones that are most relevant to that application. Also, thinking like a scientist and making sure you're communicating ways in which, I really like the examples Corey used, that you thought like a researcher, you were considering different things. Also in the research statements, something that I was told that really helped me, it's like you're really trying to communicate your capacity, your potential, and also your willingness to learn. So it's not, I know so much, I don't need to be trained anymore, but it's also not like, I don't know anything, I'm an open book, right? You're trying to say like, based on my experiences thus far, I am well positioned to be in this graduate program. I am so looking forward to learning more from you or you multiple and on the training opportunities that may get there. Again, you can also include relevant interests and experience in specific methodologies. And again, if you don't have that experience for whatever reason, speaking to in the language that a person might understand, right? You don't have to be an expert, but just saying like, I really think that fMRI though really could answer the questions that I have because of this reason, that reason, and my skills and learning other statistical methods can really help me, support me in this way. So here are some general tips. I think that's already been covered by some of the presentations already, but to get to, stating how your previous experiences brought you to your current interests feels as when I first heard it, I was like, that's kind of easy, but it's actually a little hard. And the more clearly you can make it, faculty are reviewing a lot of these statements, A, B, and C brought me to D, that's helpful. Again, it's easier, or I won't say it's easier by any means, like writing these statements is kind of hard regardless, but if you had a more linear path, that's awesome. So make sure it's clear at the end, but if you had more of a zigzag, as I've talked about, emphasize the common threads and the motivations for why you moved from one thing to another. So this is just an example, but if someone was working in a lab that really focused on infants, but wanted to study the role of parents in socialization or something, saying something like, through my experience running babies, or not running babies, but being in a lab where babies came in and we observed them, I really started getting more interested in like what the parents were doing while we were doing these assessments. So that's why I sought out opportunities in working with parents. Something that Alana had in her slides, which I highly recommend looking at that table, but yeah, using active verbs. So I generated, I designed, I implemented, rather than more like, I helped, I worked on, assisted. It makes sense. And I remember I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. All I did was help. I didn't take the lead necessarily. So you don't need to overstate your role, but you can also, that's what you did. Managed participant data is different than like worked on an Excel sheet with participant information on it. So just thinking about that. So I say, look at that table. This is a website that has job descriptions. The one that I linked here is for a social science researcher, but I really used that to like work on my CV, but also to see, is there a stronger way to say clean data? Is there a more compelling way to describe those things? Also, something else to avoid when talking about your research experiences in your personal statement is like avoiding relisting your CV word for word. I felt the urge to do that where I was like, okay, so I started in this lab from January 2016 to whatever. But in these statements, you want to really focus again on those skills, your research capacity, et cetera. So avoiding full titles, locations, other specific details that aren't really needed, someone could get from looking at your CV, unless you needed to distinguish between something that was similarly titled or something. So the example I have here is, if you want to communicate that this work, you've presented work on a national stage, I presented this work assuming that you did a brief description right before at a national conference versus going into all details. This is actually a poster I did, though I didn't do it at APA, but my poster titled Perceptions of Anxiety was presented at the 2020. So it's just a little bit clunkier. And again, it doesn't give you the space to talk about your capacity and skills. I think this is it. So I just have a list of resources, some on writing statements, but the ones that I really want to emphasize are There's lots of ones for finding post-bac positions. I think it's a really typical route that people take to not only get more experience, but also find and connect with more people who can write letters of recommendation and speak to their potential as a graduate student. So here's some links for that. Also recommend talking to faculty and staff and graduate students, I should have put there. And Dr. Mitch Prinstein says the same guide that Corey suggested. I highly recommend looking at it, though still, because I think he does a good job of talking about just different aspects of the application. I also recommend this before you apply to graduate programs piece, because I think that was something that I hadn't really thought about. Like, I'm like, it feels like it makes sense. Like, I have research experience. I like clinical psychology. Maybe I should go right now. But just taking a gut check and seeing if that's something you actually want to do. And last but not least, he's moderating. So there's Black, Indigenous, and other people of color faculty and current graduate students speaking on a panel next Monday. So this is a link to his Twitter and the sign up page, but I do recommend going to events like this to hear from faculty and other graduate students. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ariana. And maybe we can, I'm just trying to think, maybe we can share that slide out. We have the email addresses for everyone who registered to attend. So I just want to make sure I'm making a note to myself and Alexis that we try and share those links with folks. Thank you so much. All the information everyone's provided has been amazing. And next up we have Allie, who's going to talk more about the process. This relates to some of the other topics that have been covered, and she's going to expand on this idea of identifying the faculty you want to work with and the programs that are the best fit. So I will go ahead and turn it over to her now. And Allie, we can't hear you or see you. You want to make sure you start your video and unmute if you are able to do so.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, and see you. Perfect.
Fantastic. Okay. My name's Allie Silverman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a third-year graduate student in clinical psychology, and I'm going to be talking about identifying graduate programs and faculty of interest. So in terms of where to start your search, most departments have websites that you can take a look at. And I suggest searching both faculty pages and specific area pages. So if you know that you're interested in social psychology, they'll typically have a page for that, as well as a list of all of the psychology faculty that are out there. Be forewarned that if you haven't already started poking around these already, some schools' websites are better organized than others, and it may take a bit of clicking around to find what you're looking for. You'll also want to make sure that when you're looking for specific faculty, that you're looking for those faculty members that work within an area of interest to you. And sometimes faculty work across areas. So for example, Dr. Hurd works in both the community and clinical areas and accepts students to both of those areas. I would say that it's more typical that you'll see faculty housed in one area, but you just want to make sure that when you are sort of identifying, this is the faculty member that I want to work with, that they are an appropriate person to be advising you. The second thing that I recommend is looking into research articles. So, and this might sound silly, but like, are there certain studies that you've read that you've just thought, wow, this is so cool, or this is exactly the type of work that I want to be doing, or this is a question that really inspires me? Looking up the authors of that paper to see whether they're housed in a psychology department and currently advising psychology graduate students. You can also look up what's sometimes termed their psychology family. So who advised them and who they've advised, if anyone, because these are people that are likely to be doing research that's related to what you're interested in. And then the third piece with this is just checking citations that are coming up in the papers that are really exciting or interesting to you, because those too might point you to related work that sparks interest for you. in terms of conversations, reach out to and schedule as many meetings with different people who are familiar with your area of psychology as possible. And it's okay to do this with people that you don't know. We've all, and when I say we, I mean all of the graduate students that are speaking on this panel and Dr. Hurd have had these conversations when we were in your shoes, and we want to pay it forward. And they're also really fun and rewarding for us. And people, you know, at different stages in their careers will have different recommendations or ideas for different advisors or departments to be looking into. So it's always useful to sort of get as many viewpoints as possible. There's some really good books out here. The Insider's Guide to Graduate Programs in Clinical and Counseling Psychology is a fantastic resource. I also reached out to friends who weren't in the clinical area, and it was recommended that the Graduate Study in Psychology book by APA is another good one. But these are really expensive. So what I recommend that you do, if you do want to look at these books, is either checking to see if like your university library has a copy of them that you can take out, or purchasing older versions. So like the 2017 version will have some different information from the 2020 version, but mostly overlap, and you can use those and buy them for a lot cheaper. Academic Twitter, if you're not on Twitter yet, I actually just joined, but faculty frequently post about the work they're doing, what's inspiring to them right now, and you can get a real sense of sort of who they are and what drives them in the work that they're doing. They also frequently post about whether or not they're taking students for the next year. And then the last thing I have on this is lists of programs. So the one that comes to mind for me is the US News and World Report. You know, every couple of years comes up with a list of the top clinical psychology programs in the country. Major caveat to this, I think that they're pretty arbitrary, so should be taken with a grain of salt. But if you are looking sort of just to like, what are the programs that are out there? What are the names of them? Where are they located? I think that they can be useful for that. But I also just want to stress that like there are more than 20 great programs out there that will provide you with excellent training. So use those more as a tool of familiarizing yourself versus as, you know, this is the end all be all. So you found a potential match, now what? So I would check, the next step I would check is seeing if this advisor that you're interested in working with has a lab website. This will provide a lot of really good information on what's currently going on in the lab and what they're doing right now, what grants they have, any recent publications to come out of the lab, as well as general information on the studies and goings on at the lab. And also sometimes you can get a sense of sort of the lab culture. Is this an advisor who's celebrating the work of their students? Does it seem like, you know, maybe you want to work in a lab environment where they're getting together outside of sort of the research space, and sometimes they'll have like pictures of their dogs or their kids or things like this. That might be something that sort of gives you a sense of who this person is. I would say it's also really excellent to check out Google Scholar for recent papers in the past, you know, couple of years, and checking for current grant funding as well, because this will give you a sense of like what it is that the lab and that advisor are working on right now. And this is important, right, because this stuff can change and information can become out of date. And so you want to make sure that you sort of have a sense of what's going on right now. So I remember applying to work in a lab where I said like, gosh, I love the treatment research that you're doing on acceptance and commitment therapy. And the advisor was like, we're not doing that anymore. So it's really important to try to sort of make your best effort to get a sense of like what it is, what are the questions that they're investigating right now. And one of the best ways to do that is to reach out to current graduate students, because they'll have information on that, and they'll have information on like, if you were to jump in next year, what are the projects and opportunities that would be available for you? How is it that the mentor sort of sets you up to start working? Do you just jump right in when you get there, or how is the scaffolding set up for you? Things like this. But also talking to former graduate students can be another sort of great thing as well, because they can be more honest with you about their experiences working with that mentor, and sometimes can answer questions that current graduate students might feel less comfortable answering. What else to keep in mind? So when is a good time to start thinking about this? I found looking for programs and advisors to be one of the most fun parts of the process for me. So I got started in like the late spring of the year that I planned to apply by creating a mega list of schools that I was slowly narrowing down over the year. And one of the recommendations that I give people is to use an Excel spreadsheet to keep track of this. So a column for the name of the program, a column for the name of the advisor, a column for a little bit about the research that they're doing, and then any sort of other information that's important to you that you want to track. So is location something that's really important to you? Is sort of your sense of like the value that they place in diversity, equity, and inclusion something that's really important to you that maybe you want to rate on a list of 1 to 5 of what you're seeing based off of the website or conversations with other people? If you're applying to clinical programs, maybe the like clinical research balance is an important question for you. So that's something that you could keep track of. And then a place for any comments or additional notes. So I found tracking this information really helpful. I color coded it. I had sort of ranks of like highly interested to less interested in the programs. And then as I was sort of going through the application process, I could also create columns to like check off, okay, you know, I've written the personal statement and things like this for it. How many programs to apply to? I'm going to sort of skip through this for purposes of time, but I think it varies program to program. For clinical programs, I've heard that like applying to 10, around 10 is a good sort of idea, but I'm less familiar, and other people in different areas can speak to what it was like for them and the number that made sense for them. Should you contact anyone before you apply? So I would say definitely email a potential advisor if you cannot find anywhere on the department website or their lab website whether or not they're accepting students for that year. If you don't hear back from them, do not take that to mean that they're not interested in working with you. These are just incredibly busy people. I chose to email everyone. I kept it super brief. I introduced myself, where I was working, so I was doing a research post-bac at the time. I said a little bit about, I'm really excited about the work you're doing on X, making sure that it's, you know, relevant and up to date. And then I'm interested in applying to work in your lab, and attaching my CV. Be prepared for them to want to set up a meeting with you. I did have this happen a couple of times, and that's really exciting, but can sort of be a surprise if you're not sort of ready for that stage. And I would say mentors vary hugely in terms of how much they care if you're contacting them beforehand. The one just thing to keep in mind is that if you are reaching out, to make sure that you're sort of not saying anything that will sort of come to, I don't want to say to hurt you, but like anything on sort of research that's not at all relevant to the work that they're doing, or things like this that might make them think, I'm not sure if this person's a great fit. And then lastly, application fee waivers. So applying to graduate school is really, really expensive. This year it will be a little bit better in terms of expenses that people are racking up because you won't be paying for travel. But there are application fee waivers, and the process will vary from program to program. But typically information is outlined about how to request a fee waiver somewhere in the description of the admissions process. You may have to start the application in order to request the fee waiver. So that means setting up a username and account with whatever program they are using. And it's important to sort of look at this information before you submit your application, because oftentimes they'll only reimburse you if you apply for the fee waiver before you submit your application. If the program website is at all unclear or confusing, I recommend reaching out either to your potential advisor or, and probably first, checking out the department's staff page, which will typically have someone who, under their job description, is in charge of coordinating applications for prospective students, and they will be able to direct you clearly and give you any information that you have that's not presented well on the website. So that's what I have. There's my email address if anyone has any further questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Allie. That was so helpful. And I will say for here at UVA, definitely check out for the Graduate College of Arts and Sciences. You can even just do a Google search, the Graduate College Arts and Sciences UVA. That is where you'll get some information about the overall process of applying to any program in the College of Arts and Sciences, which psychology is. And it will also have fee waiver information there. And so that is maybe unique to UVA, and I'm not sure how every institution does it, but that was a helpful reminder, Allie, about that information. And I will also co-sign that often faculty do not keep their university websites as updated as they should. And so I just thought that was I just recently updated mine, but realized that we've been working on several new projects and that was not reflected on my webpage, which is not fair at all to students who are interested in working with me. But yes, I think that's just such a great point to clarify, are these still the projects you're working on? Are there any new ones? And not just assume the website's up to date. And sometimes if faculty list publications and you see the ones they have listed are from a few years ago and not recent, that's another great point about checking Google Scholar, because things change rapidly and sometimes we don't keep up with that. So at this point, I am going to ask for all of our panelists to make their to start their video and to unmute themselves.
I don't think I can start my video. I think I'm not the.
That's okay. We can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. I'm gonna turn mine on too. All right. I think Alexis is saying she's having some computer issues, but it looks like we're all here, and she and I are co-hosts. I'm hoping. It does seem like the technology demons do not want to let us live today, but we are still going. I think we're still okay. Okay, so my first question here that I have is for Ilana. You can hear me okay, right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the question is, are there any things that you would recommend excluding from the CV, and how do you deal with experiences that might show good qualities and characteristics but may not be academic?
It's a great question. Yeah, so it's interesting because with the CV, you want to be judicious in what you include. And I think that ultimately when deciding what to put on the CV, you want to just remember the intended audience. So you'll be changing your CV throughout your career depending on what you're applying for and who's going to be the recipient. I applied for a really technical oriented fellowship recently and totally reformatted my CV to match this funder's ideas and things like that. But so all that to say, I think it's important to just really think about what you want to convey. And so for the purposes of grad school admission, I think anything you're wondering about, you could just ask yourself do I want my future mentor to know this, or do I want to highlight this? And I would also assume anything on your CV will get read by anyone who has it. And that includes not only your mentor, but any other grad students, faculty in the program. As far as I can't think of any specific things not to include. I feel generally you all probably have really good judgment about the kind of experiences that are relevant. I think probably anything that doesn't, I think something that maybe to not include is anything that it can't really be tied into kind of what you're interested in pursuing going forward. And I know that's kind of vague, and I think it's probably because this is a little bit circumstantial. If you had a job that was really meaningful to you that had nothing to do with psychology, I think that could be really important to include. Yeah, but I think it does depend a little bit case by case. I hope that answers the question.
That's great. Thank you. We now have a few questions that I think all relate to the same thing. So, and I think maybe asking Allie and Corey first, and others are certainly welcome to weigh in, because I also know we have just like variability in our own experiences. But the questions are kind of like, you know, how many faculty members is it appropriate to mention like in your statement, or Allie, like as you're like selecting faculty, let's say you're sure you want to apply and work with at least one person at UVA, like should you mention other faculty who you may want to also, you know, be in their lab or work with? And then also, I think the other issue here is like, what if that other faculty member is not in that program? So like you're applying to clinical, but you want to work with a social psych faculty member. So if Corey and Allie maybe want to start, and then if other folks want to weigh in too.
Yeah, sure. So I'll go with the like multiple faculty members if you're interested in multiple faculty members first. It's totally appropriate, and I've seen this where people have expressed interest in working with more than one. I don't want to give a hard and fast rule, but I would say, you know, like capping it at 2. If there really are 3 people that you're excited about, perhaps you could put 3. And I want to say that just because people that are reading your personal statement want to see that you have somewhat of a focus on the type of research that you're interested in doing, right? So if you're saying, I'm really interested in this anxiety researcher, but Dr. Hurd's work on mentorship is really fascinating too, it might sort of come across to those researchers as it's less clear of what you actually are interested in doing. There are, however, absolutely cases in which there's more of a clear match between the work that 2 people are doing. And I think in those cases, that's absolutely appropriate. I also would suggest that sort of indicating, you know, who is the person that you would want to serve as your primary mentor is important in those cases. I think in terms of Corey, do you want to sort of speak to that one before I jump on to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I would agree with that. I think it can be helpful to list more than one person. I think just in case, yeah, I don't know. I think it just, you know, in case there's some issue with that professor, it shows a little bit more flexibility. So I typically put 2 professors on each statement, but definitely agree. I think it's helpful to really target the statement towards kind of your primary professor and make it really clear, which I think often you can do both in the statement and as part of the application. You're sort of marking like order of professor of interest.
And yeah. I think that's a really, yeah, go ahead, Noah.
So just to chime in on that, I don't always know how much transparency there is for students to understand that a lot of times admissions processes at the graduate level can happen a little bit more unilaterally. And I don't think that students are always aware of that. And so I think to build on Allie and Corey's point, you want to keep in mind that this isn't always going to be something where a big committee is like looking at this and making decisions. A lot of times the primary faculty mentor who you mention is going to have a lot of say in that decision. And so that just further bolsters Allie's point about it's fine to mention other faculty, but just make sure you have a clear connection there, because the primary person who might be evaluating your application to even decide whether or not to invite other people to kind of review it and be involved may be needing to see that there's like coherence there. Sorry, that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, I think it's interesting and like great to sort of hear panelists because we have differing opinions, right? Corey said, I included 2 people in every statement. For me, I think I did that one time. So you're really going to sort of hear something different from other people, and it'll just highlights like, don't, the major thing here is don't say you want to work with someone if you're not interested in the work that they're doing. Just because that won't be fun for you. In terms of wanting to work with someone who doesn't, like if you say wanted to apply for a clinical program, but you're really interested in the work of someone in the community area, I think if that was someone like Dr. Hurd, who is across both of those areas, it would be perfectly appropriate. And I know one of the fantastic things about our program is you can certainly, upon getting accepted to one of the areas, Ariane is a great person who can speak to this. I certainly think that she sort of is equally housed at this point between the community and clinical areas, though she applied to work in the clinical area. I would suggest not solely applying to work with someone who works in a different area than the area that you're applying to work in. That doesn't sound like a wise decision to me.
I would say, so I think it really varies program to program. I definitely, which is again, good example of panelists, I definitely did apply to professors who were, I think my research interests are kind of at the developmental and clinical intersection. So there were definitely professors who had really like relevant research interests, but weren't in the clinical area. So I reached out to those professors and said, I really want to get a clinical PhD, but I'm really interested in your research. And they, were able to field those questions. But I think that varies a lot program to program. So I definitely think that's an appropriate thing to email people about. And I think it's a good thing to kind of weigh. I think it's sort of a personal decision if you want to do that. But I think that you don't necessarily need to rule out professors if they're not in the area that you want to be. And that might be specific to clinical. I can only really speak to like clinical versus not clinical, but just my experience.
I think you're right to point out, everyone should be aware also there is a fair amount of variability across departments in how admissions are done. And I don't know that students can always know what that's going to look like. Sometimes admissions are really done by area. And so there may be less flexibility in that, like in terms of just, I think we try here to make sure if someone applies for one area, but mentions a faculty in another area, that we make sure that area gets notified to review the application. But it does require some coordination. And so I think, just the point here is to be aware that there's not necessarily a standardized process across all departments. And you do want to be mindful of that. And that might also be, I think Ali talked a lot about, the value of trying to reach out to faculty in advance. And it is true that faculty don't always have time to respond and, maybe getting many of these emails. So it's not just yours. And so that's probably why sometimes there's a delay or a real challenge replying. But that could be a really good question to ask a faculty mentor in advance, because you could say, I really want to apply to the social program. I know you're in developmental. Would you be able to, how would that work? Or, can you give me any kind of advice about that? Because the other thing we definitely would never want to do is apply and not get seriously considered for some kind of technicality. Ariana or Zoe or Alana, does anyone else want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I can add a bit about it's funny because I remember getting prompts in some of my statements to list more than one person in mind to talk about research interests. So agree, I listed multiple and explain similarly to explaining your research experience, like explain why these things may fit together. So the points that folks have been making about coherence and like making it very clear, they don't have to guess why you put a social psychologist and a developmental psychologist. I also think some advice that I got, which, take with a grain of salt, it might be a gauge check if like, are you able to work with other people? So even if your main research interest is in something, let's say for whatever reason, I think Corey alluded to this, like if something doesn't work out, is there anyone else that you might be able to be compatible with? I think that's a useful question to think about. That's not necessarily a reason not to apply to a program, but something to consider. And then, yeah, just speaking to, because I see now that people asked, I didn't know, I applied to Dr. Hurd's lab because I was interested in the work that was being done, but I wanted clinical training. And so we talked about it, having someone at the intersection was really helpful. And that's something I think I expanded over time. So my first year was pretty clinical focused with class and stuff. And then now I've been able to collaborate. But I remember mentioning Dr. Lenny Savory, who's Alexis's mentor, in my statement too, because it was something that I cared about. I also wanted to say, please come back to me. Clinical. Oh, that there are clinical community programs. Sorry. So there are doctoral programs that kind of get at this intersection. So if you're really interested in community psych and want clinical training, I think there's a handful, at least 5 that exists already. So look at the faculty and the work that they're doing in those programs, and then it's a natural marriage. They plan their curriculum around that collaboration. So.
Noelle, I can't hear you.
Mm-mm.
Mm-mm. The
Noelle,
demons
you
are
want to
back.
try turning your video off and seeing if then we can hear you? Hmm.
Mm-mm.
I wonder if it would be possible to connect with like phone audio or
Mhm.
something. I guess while they're getting set, so since I didn't speak on that question, I think what everyone else said is great. And I, only applied to an advisor in the area that I wanted to work with. Um, and I think the themes of coherence are important ones. And if you're interested in a certain area, but only interested in the research of someone who's in a different area, it seems like you'd want to make a particularly strong case and definitely would want to reach out ahead of time and just see if that's something that the department would be amenable to.
And something that happened to me during the admissions process, which I was not expecting, was you might get tapped for a different mentor than the one you apply to, or a different lab, which is kind of interesting. I mean, this is less like something you would necessarily apply for, but especially if you're applying to programs where, maybe it's a little bit bigger, or there's faculty who are doing similar work. Like you might have a faculty who says, oh, like this, you seem like a great applicant, but I'm not taking a student this year, but like my colleague is. Like, are you interested in so and so? So be prepared for that possibility as well. And I think it's just good to be familiar with the other faculty in the area you're interested in, so that when you go in to meet Dr. So-and-so, you kind of know, at least in general, broad strokes of what their kind of interests are. But.
Just to add to that, I think something that's kind of interesting, and again varies program to program, is that like not every professor is able to take a student every year, and so sometimes like some professors are able to take a student but some aren't. So I think that I agree, Alana, that is something that happens, I think, and because that happens because not all professors are taking students every year. So you might be, the person you wanted is not taking a student, but someone else in the program who can take a student and is interested in you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, so sorry. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, forgive me, Ali, if you already made this point, but I remember being like, when I email faculty ahead of time, I'll ask them if they're taking students. One, like check to make sure that that's like nowhere. Like check to make sure that's not on the department website, not on their personal website, not on their personal, like be really clear, because that's one of the first like incidents. If like you're like, oh, are you taking students, and that's really clearly listed somewhere else, then you didn't do your due diligence. So that was just a small point.
I see we have another question about, is it best to explain a history of nonviolent incarceration in your personal statement? Disclose to faculty that I am interested in working with, or have a letter writer speak on this, since most programs require disclosure of felony convictions and stigma surrounds incarceration. In addition, would this cause any problems with clinical obligations and requirements? Fantastic question.
So really interested in everyone's thoughts here, but from my understanding, at least the like adage I was given is like, have it be talked about in your letter, or like letting letters of recommendation really speak to times you were struggling. So that's a very specific case, but I'm thinking also like grades that weren't stellar, or like failures of classes, or absence or time away for, you know, medical leave or things like that. Just getting in front of it and mentioning it, though I do think that I understand your inclination. I think that might be the right one, to reach out and see if there are things at like the graduate program level, because I know there's a grad application in addition to the advisor specific. I can't speak to that, but I do think telling letters of recommenders or letter recommenders that you trust and you think could handle that information sensitively, so they know.
And then in terms of whether or not, or like the impact on clinical training experiences, I think that's another excellent question. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be another one where it's like, it depends. I can speak to the fact that I'm working currently on a child and adolescent inpatient unit right now, and I did have to complete a background check to be able to go to that, where you would disclose a nonviolent incarceration. However, they didn't sort of make it clear to me at what point they would say, you know, this is sort of our threshold for being able to work in the setting or not. And so my guess is that there's like different sort of expectations or standards, or for lack of a better word, because neither one of those are appropriate words, but sort of like what they're looking for in a background check versus in others. And I think it could be limiting in some cases, but in a lot of them, I don't think that it would be.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Allie. And I think this is one of those cases where best to be, best to be upfront, whether that's via your letter or recommendation, like Ariana suggested, or directly in, either in communication with like the director of clinical training or your faculty member, just because it will come up in your kind of clinical placements at some point.
Can you all hear me now or still no?
Yes.
Okay. I muted it earlier because my dog started barking, and then when I went to unmute, it just was not having it. So I didn't even come back, but thank you all for handling that question. I think that was related to another question, and I do think this is one where it'd be great for other folks to weigh into, because I know Corey spoke about this a little bit in the personal statement. I do think that's one of the most misleading aspects of applying to grad school, is that it's called a personal statement. And so it seems intuitive that it would be personal and that you would talk about personal experiences. And I think that would include challenges, adversity. I think this question about having, experienced incarceration or any legal troubles. And so, I'd love to hear from other folks about this as well. And I think, this could expand, and in our next session, we'll be talking about, other kind of personal experiences, disability challenges, social identities, things that probably matter a lot to a person and what their experience might be like in the space. And so I think that issue of disclosure can be a really tricky one. I have seen times when, I think it is a great piece of advice to say, if you're going to talk about anything personal, you want to make sure you're doing it in a way that kind of connects with this academic story of like, what your academic experiences have been and what your interests are. And it's not uncommon. You've probably heard that expression that research is me search. And so people are interested in studying things that might relate to like their lived experiences. And so I think it can be really powerful sometimes to talk about a personal experience or connection, to say, so therefore this has really kind of fueled my interest and passion and drive for this type of research. I think what Corey was also just trying to note, though, is that unfortunately, which I think that, it's an awful reality to say that, especially if you were applying Imagine to like a clinical psych program, where we're working so hard to destigmatize mental illness. It is not untrue, though, what she said, that you may still find faculty, even in a clinical program, where disclosing your own mental health challenges may be stigmatized. It may, faculty member, may, make a less favorable decision, which, I hate to have to say that out loud. I wish it was not true, but unfortunately, I think to some extent, that may still be an issue, and that may vary across programs. And so I think it does come back to, you know, I think some part of that question that was typed into the Q&A got at both the idea of like, you know, what are the things that are really important to me, or what are the lived experiences I've had that may matter for the research I do, or the opportunities that I may have going forward. And you know, is it important that I say I've had those experiences? And then if it is a place who then does somehow hold that against me, or who uses that negatively, kind of weaponizes it or whatever, maybe that's not a good place for me to be, right? So I think that could be one stance, to say, I'm going to be open, I'm going to be transparent. If that does end up, for whatever reason, counting against me, that says more about the program than it does about me. But I also think, you know, it's just good. I prefer that students know that going in, and that students make those decisions themselves, because you wouldn't want to apply, you know, we wouldn't want to encourage you and say, put everything in there about your, you know, your personal life. And again, I would say only put things about your personal life that tie into kind of the story of why you would be a good graduate student and why you want to pursue the PhD. But just be mindful, right? That what you disclose, be mindful of that possibility. And if that's fine with you, and it's actually maybe important to you that you screen out places that are not going to be supportive, you know, that's fine. But just know that whatever you're sharing is not always going to be used favorably. And that is just something that I think students should be aware of and make decisions around. I don't know if anybody else wants to. I mean, I think it's just that idea of what you put in a personal statement and how you share it. And I think on the one hand, I see people just steer away from personal things altogether, which is fine. And I think in other cases, I've seen some personal sharing, as long as it ties into a story about, you know, why they would be an excellent graduate student. And that can make a lot of sense too. And I just also want to acknowledge the limitations of the faculty and the programs. And, you know, this is something that I hope that we will continue to kind of work against, and not, you know, not be doing these kinds of problematic things. But I think Corey's absolutely right to just put that on your radar, that unfortunately that may still be a reality in some places.
I really quickly, there's a question about research experience in another field. I was a religion major in undergrad, and so I certainly, it was suggested to me, like, if there are, you know, places either in your undergraduate background, or if you had a career before deciding to pursue psychology, those are totally appropriate things to talk about in your personal statement. Not like, as personal statement is so short, like Corey mentioned, that you don't want to spend a half a page talking about the experience and research in the other field, but certainly, you know, a couple of sentences speaking to that. And again, to your sort of overall narrative, like Dr. Hurd was saying, about like, these are sort of the couple of either skills that I learned from this other research experience in this different field, or these led me to these different questions. So for example, with religion, I think I was talking about like ways of coping and individual differences, and those related to psychological questions that I had. If you can sort of make like a natural narrative and pulling those pieces along with those psychological research experiences that you have, I think that's totally appropriate.
And I can quickly speak to the GPA question, just like if it improved later on. I think, yeah, that's something, again, that a recommender could speak to. The way that it was framed for me, because I'm thinking back, like, did not do well in cognitive and biopsychology. I'll never forget those two classes really like brought my GPA down, but showing that, you know, there was a time in which I wasn't performing for whatever reason, whether that be outside or internally, but I improved. I made changes distinctly, and like, again, going back to that capacity and potential piece, I have the capacity to take feedback. I have the capacity to change things that aren't working. And I have the potential to continue this upward trajectory in the future. So I would say that.
I think also, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you just said. And I also think, like, I've seen people really successfully say explicitly, you know, I was on medical leave this semester, and as a consequence, like, you know, my grade suffered a little bit. And like, you can very directly address that in your statement, and future applications and things like that. I think that's really commonplace to do as well. And I agree with everything Ariana said.
All right, excellent and perfect timing. I think that was the last question from the Q&A, and those were all excellent panels, excellent responses to questions. So thank you so much, Allie, Alana, Corey, Zoe, Ariana. That was super helpful. I think we'll make their slides available. I know there was some hyperlinks and stuff in there, and everybody was very generous about sharing their email addresses. And so we'll share that with registered participants after today's panel. So I will, if you all are welcome to leave or stick around and listen if you like, and we will now be switching over to our next panel. I'm going to give Alexis just a moment to pull up. We're going to change the view here. All right, perfect. And as we mentioned earlier, this second portion of the visit day is focused on, once you've submitted the applications, but now we're trying to focus a little bit more on that process of selecting the program. And we also will have students talking about their experiences to give you just a better sense of what it's like to be a graduate student. So I will go ahead and turn it over as our first panelist is, can you advance the slide, Alexis? Mina, perfect. Who I did see. Mina, you will have to start your video and unmute.
Okay, sorry. As soon as I took over the mouse, I couldn't see the function to turn my video on, but okay. Can everyone see my mouse moving around?
I cannot see your mouse, but I can see you and hear you and see your slide.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'm gonna have to probably ask Alexis once more if I can control.
If you need her to advance your slide, you can just say slide and she can advance it for you.
Okay. All right, so I will be presenting on the topic of student recruitment process. I am a second year PhD student in the social neuroscience and epigenetics lab. My name is Mina and I use she, her, hers. Okay, so in terms of just being notified once you submit your application material, you'll most likely be notified by email from the school about being interviewed or being invited for an interview. And some applicants might have already done a phone or a virtual interview with the PI that they applied to prior to the in-person visit, just because some PIs have a preference of sort of pre-screening their applicants. And then close to the visit, you will be sent a schedule of the visit that will include activities like meals with current grad students, interviews with faculty members, social events, talks, etc. And of course, there is this caveat in that due to COVID, schedules this year for all schools, I'm sure, will be different. And a lot of them probably won't have in-person components. But just for fun, here's a screenshot of the schedule that I was sent for my interview at UVA. And it's pretty similar to, I think, other schools in that, but the nice thing was that they had a student literally pick me up from the airport and drive me to every single location. And, you know, my plane ticket and hotel fee was paid for, which was also really nice. That's not a guarantee for all programs. Yeah, bunch of talks or interviews, and then also a mix of socializing events. And then the last day there was the brunch for students of color, and then I got to sit in on a class before being sent to the airport again. So to prepare for the interviews, you will most likely interview with 2 to 5 faculty members one-on-one, or you might be in a faculty panel. And I, for example, for UVA, interviewed with my PI, of course, and then also all of the other faculty members in my area. And that was just sort of assigned to me, but some schools will also let you like choose which faculty members you want to meet with. So schools have a different policy. And then in terms of prepping for your interview with the PI, because that's kind of the most important interview, you will, most likely have already done the prep work for your PI, when you were applying. So this is sort of, you want to, review that research you did, but you also want to deepen your understanding of the lab you're applying for so that you can demonstrate your knowledge and fit at the interview, but also for you to really think concretely about what projects you want to do. So of course, you're going to read their profile on the UVA Psych Department website, if this was a UVA interview, and then you can go through their lab website and see what projects they're working on, what the grad students are working on, who their collaborators are. Reading their CV can also have some information that's helpful, and then reading their recent publications, preferably the ones in which they're first or last author. And then also see if they have any recorded talks on YouTube. I did that for all of my interview prep, and it helps just to know how they present and how they phrase their research, to the public. And then also read through their tweets if they're on Twitter. And this was an advice I was given by a faculty member who said that, if he was to interview himself for an interview, he would probably read through all his tweets and then see the ones about sort of like research ideas and then bring them up during the interview. And he described it as like an inception process where you're pretending like this was your idea, but really it was like based on a tweet. But then that will make the interviewer think that you guys are on the same page, and it can sort of be a strategic way to just glean more info about your PI's thought process. For the prep work that you will be doing for the other faculty member interviews, it doesn't have to be as thorough, but I would recommend that you read their bios and you look through their lab website and read at least the abstracts of their recent publications. And then for each of the faculty members, you should think of 2 to 3 questions about their research for you to ask them, because most likely in these interviews, they'll tell you about the research they do. Then afterwards, you would just kind of ask them, oh, what do you think about this and that, just to show your background knowledge. And then, of course, to prep for the interview responses you'll be giving, you should review your application material and practice interviewing with a professor or a staff member at the Career Center. The Career Center prep work is helpful in just organizing your thoughts and learning how to just, perform at interviews competently, I guess, generally, and then prep work with your professor or PI, if you have the access, is helpful in helping you really craft your interview responses so that they're specific to research. And this is a link I included that has some sample questions that you can use to practice interviewing. So aside from the questions you'll be asking your PI on the sort of specific research questions and methodologies, these are general questions that are good to ask to get a sense of the lab, to get a sense of the program, and because those factors will really affect your quality of life and fit in your PhD program. So asking questions like, what skills help students in your lab be successful? What's the typical pace? What are lab meetings like? Where do you see your research going in the future? What are the opportunities for funding? Do faculty members use individual development plans, etc.? Because every PI has a different way of communicating with their students. It's helpful to know, if some PIs are a little bit more intentional about how they do that. In terms of students to ask questions to ask students, I think this is going to be really important this year because you're most likely not going to be visiting the university in person. So it might be harder for you to get a sense of place and the sense of community. So really asking questions about, like, what do you do during your downtime or during the summer? What's it like to live in Charlottesville? What are the graduates doing? How do faculty members get along? Is it a collaborative lab? This is kind of a way to see how maybe if there's a sense of competitiveness in the program. You can ask, what their observations are in terms of work-life balance with their family or partner. Are there people in the program who have kids? And then, how affordable, typo right there, but how affordable is housing in Charlottesville with the current stipend? And is that stipend continuous, and for how many years? Some programs will have these really high stipends, but it's only guaranteed for the first year. So that's also something to look out for. And then, questions about collaborations and how are students supported? Do you have your own desk / space? And this was a question that a senior person in psychology suggested I ask, because apparently in some psych programs, some students might not have their own space. So these are sort of those kinds of questions to ask to really gauge what it's like day to day. And then other resources, this is a list that was created by Dr. Jay Van Bavel, who is a social psychologist at NYU. And this is just like a 3-page list of questions to ask to faculty members and students about the program or about funding or teaching, etc. So after the interview, you should send a thank you email to all the people you spoke with, whether that's faculty members or grad students, and whether it was on Zoom or in person or on the phone. And it can be short, but it should be sent within a few days of your interview, and the sooner the better. And make sure to convey, interest and gratitude, enthusiasm. Here is a sample template of how you can phrase that email. So you would just say, dear, or hello, Dr. So-and-so. Thank you for your time, or thank you for meeting with me. Thank you for telling me more about your research. Then you can add in a line about how that interview conversation impacted you and your research questions going forward, or what you enjoyed learning about. Put in any optional questions you might have that you have lingering. Say that our conversation further interests my interest in this program. And if this program is your first choice, then it can be actually helpful and advantageous if you mention that to the PI, but of course you have to be honest, because if you say, yes, this is my first choice, and then the PI offers you a place and then you turn it down, then that will put your PI in a very awkward spot, especially since they probably, advocated for you and vouched for you. So you just have to be honest about that. It means that, yes, you will definitely accept if you get an offer. And so the last sentence is just kind of formulaic, please let me know if I can provide you with any additional information. Thank you for your consideration, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. And so this is my last slide. And the last thing I just wanted to include was that during your interview process, it's very possible that you might not be able to answer you might not get answers to all of your questions, or you might not have anyone to ask specific questions to if you were kind of hoping to get matched with someone who has more common ground with you or more shared experiences with you. And if that is the case, you should definitely reach out to a student or a staff coordinating the visit, because in my experience, people are very willing to match you with someone who could better answer your specific questions. So in my situation, like I'm an international student, my area doesn't have other international students. So during one of the dinners, I asked just if I could talk to someone who had that experience. And then also during the Students of Color brunch, right, there wasn't anyone in my area there at the event. So then I just emailed someone and asked to be connected with someone in that area. And I was connected to like an alum in my area who did a lot of work on diversity, and I was able to get their honest input. So your interview experience might not cover all of the bases, but if you have unanswered questions, I would really encourage you to reach out for more connections, even if it's with someone you didn't necessarily meet during the interview process. And with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Mina. That was very helpful information. Really good tips. And so next up we have Maura, who is going to be talking about faculty and program selection. And Maura, I I believe you maybe are not using slides, but if you don't mind starting your video and unmuting so that we can see and hear you.
Guys, can you all see me?
Yes, and hear you.
Great. So my name is Mara. I'm a fourth year in the social area, and I work with primarily with Ben Converse. We mostly work on goal pursuit and social cognition in general. And I'm going to be talking about choosing the right faculty and program for you. So you guys have already talked about how to identify a faculty member that you want to apply to based on research interests. But in addition to research interests, you also want to look for mentors who are a good fit for you as a mentor. Okay. So when you're evaluating labs and programs, it's going to be common to want to gravitate towards researchers that are really like well-known or really high achieving, because you might think that if you're trained by a really good and high achieving researcher, then you're going to become a high achieving researcher too. But actually what you need when you're in grad school is a really good mentor. So what you want to look for is somebody who is really mindful and deliberate about their mentorship. And the way that you can try to get a feel for that is in talking with them, of course, seeing how many thoughts they have about the mentor and mentee relationship, and how many questions they have for you about your fit. And you can also talk to other grad students in the area to try to get a feel for how much time the mentor spends with them and how supportive the mentor is of the students. Oh, I just want to make a note here that grad school can be like really, really challenging and a really taxing 5 to 6 years. So it's really important to have a mentor who is supportive and not adding, potentially more stress or anxiety to that process, just to help your whole grad school experience. Okay, so then after, Okay, so after making sure you have found somebody who prioritizes their mentorship, you want to make sure that you have a good mentor and mentee fit. And that's going to be different for everybody, right? So there's going to be a few things you want to think about yourself and your work style as you're going into the interviews and then as you're choosing a program to know what makes a good fit for you. So the first thing is to think about whether you want to be more independent or whether you would prefer an advisor who's more hands-on. So some people prefer to have their own specific research lines in mind when they enter grad school, and they want to kind of set up their studies on their own and pursue those on their own and then check in with their advisor as needed. And then other people would prefer advisors who kind of give them a path to follow, and they meet often with their students and they brainstorm together and they write together in a more collaborative way. So it just depends on what you would prefer for your experience, and then look for the same corresponding thing in your mentor. Okay, and then some PIs, the way they run their lab is going to be much more focused on a very specific line of research or topic. And they might only pursue that specific line of research, and they're not interested in other types of related questions. And then in other labs, people have more broad ranges of interest, and they might be more open to pursuing new types of research questions. So again, here you're going to want to think about whether you have a really explicit, exact idea of what kind of question and what kind of research line you want to pursue, or whether you kind of have a broad interest in something like social cognition in general, and you want to be able to pursue lots of different topics within that area. Okay, and then one more thing to think about when you're talking to your PI and choosing a PI is to think about whether they are early career versus a late career researcher. And there's pros and cons to working with both, of course, but they're going to be at very different stages in their career, and that's going to have an impact on how they do their work. So early career researchers, they might not be as well-known or as established as like late career researchers, but they're going to probably be motivated to be producing a lot of work. And that could be either good or bad for you. So if they're producing a lot of work, then that probably means that you have a good chance of doing lots of work and getting a lot of work done in that lab. But it also might mean that they don't have enough time to prioritize you. It just depends on the specific PI. And then for late career researchers, they obviously are probably going to have more name recognition and a more established network that might be able to get you benefits in the industry or in academia. But they might not be producing as many papers or working as quickly as earlier career researchers. But again, that totally depends on the specific researchers. So what you can do to get a feel for how much work is getting done and how quickly it's getting done in the lab and how that's gonna help support your grad career. You can look at the lab's papers that were published in the last like 1 to 5 years. And if no papers have come out of that lab recently, then that might be kind of a red flag, because you want to make sure that you're going to be producing papers and work as like by the time that you finish grad school. You want to have a good CV. And if they haven't produced any papers in the last 5 years, that might be a problem for your CV at the end of your grad school. Okay. And then for choosing a program, the most notable difference that I have heard talked about between programs is competitive versus collaborative programs and the culture in the department. So here at UVA, we have a pretty super collaborative program, I think, or at least that's been my impression in the social area so far. And that means when we have departmental talks, most of the questions in the Q&A session tend to be a lot more kind of curiosity driven. There's not as much criticism or those critiquing feedbacks in our Q&As. And that can have, again, its pros and cons. Some people prefer more competitive environments, right? If you prefer to have collaborators or coworkers who are going to be giving you lots of constructive feedback and offering you criticism so that you're more prepared when you get to the job market, then maybe a more competitive culture would be better for you. But if you would prefer to have a culture that prioritizes collaboration, then you're going to want to look for signs of a more collaborative department. And again, that's something that you can kind of gauge by talking to the grad students and seeing how often grad students collaborate on projects together and between areas, between departments as well. Oops. Okay. And then a couple other points to look for when you're evaluating the program. You want to keep in mind whether you want a program that is going to be purely basic or whether there's going to be opportunities for translating that basic research to application. So that just, again, depends on what you want and what you see for yourself in your career after grad school. So if you want to have opportunities where you're going to be conducting basic research, but then also having an eye towards application, then you want to look for programs that are going to support that for you. And that might include collaborating with like the Curry School of Education that we have at UVA. I know lots of students in psychology collaborate with and are like dual hired in Curry as well. And also with the policy school and with the business schools. And that's some outlets that you have for being able to translate your basic research to application. But if that's not something that you're interested in, then it's not something that you have to look for in your programs. And then, okay, fine. The most important tip or the most helpful tip that I've heard in choosing a program is to look for potential collaborators in the area. So if you're choosing between like 2 or 3 or more programs, then you're going to want to look for a program where the PI that you're applying to is not the only person who does anything related to your interests. So you want to look for other potential faculty members that are there that you wouldn't mind working with. And that gives you some space to be able to pursue other interests if your interests happen to change when you're in grad school. And it also gives you kind of like a fallback just in case anything were to happen with your PI, or if you realize that your PI is not a good fit for you, then it gives you some freedom to be able to fall back on another advisor if you have to. Okay, so that is all I have. I will pass it on to Shannon.
Thank you, Maura. That was excellent. And Shannon, if you don't mind just unmuting and starting your video.
Absolutely. Great. So, great. So my name is Shannon Sabell. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a fourth year in the clinical area here at UVA. I'm really excited and honored to be able to speak with you all today. So I'll be talking about graduate student life. And so I'll go over a couple different topics like preparing for your first year, talk about coursework a little bit and TA-ships, funding, getting involved in different departmental committees, as well as some first year experiences in UVA psychology. So in preparing for first year, these are some of the elements that are tailored to UVA in particular, but would definitely generalize to other schools as well. One thing I definitely recommend and was recommended to me is trying to take a break before the semester starts. So if you're wrapping up a master's program or your job before graduate school, just being able to take a little bit of time to yourself to be able to relax before kind of the stress of grad school begins. One thing that we do here at UVA is a graduate student retreat where the whole first year cohort gets together over the weekend to get to know one another and kind of start to form that support network among the cohort. And then in addition to that, we have an R boot camp, which is the R software for quantitative analysis. That is a great introduction to kind of coding and using that program before the research methods course starts in the fall. So that's another way of preparing for first year. So now switching gears to coursework. So it really varies across the different areas. Except for research methods. So at least at UVA, as a cohort of first year students, we have a research methods course in the fall, which is really kind of more theory-based, understanding statistics. And then in the spring, there's a more applied course that we all take together. And then in general, it's around 2 to 3 classes per semester, or about 12 units for the first 2 years of study in the PhD program. This is going to look a little bit different for clinical students, and that'll kind of be a theme throughout the rest of my slides. But in general, they're like introductory courses to the work that you'll be doing in each of the areas, in addition to research methods, which would apply to all areas. So now talking a little bit about TA-ships. So at UVA, and this really varies from school to school, so this is something that can be a really helpful question in the interview process about how many hours per week you are expected to work or is on average when you're a TA. Here at UVA, the TA-ship responsibilities typically include things like attending lecture, leading review sessions, holding office hours, creating exam questions, proctoring exams, and there are also typically opportunities for guest lecturing in the course. And that really varies across the different classes, but it typically is a potential opportunity in many of the courses at UTA. And here at UVA, we have graduate teacher training. There's a lot that you learn on the job and you learn as you go, but we have some really helpful courses in being able to teach to small groups of students, to large lecture courses, and in discussion sections as well, which really facilitates and I think scaffolds our learning as teachers. And then also here at UVA, we have an opportunity called the Distinguished Teaching Fellowship, which is an opportunity to design your own course in a kind of small seminar course. It's a really incredible opportunity to be instructor of record and to develop your own syllabus and then teach your course. And I'm actually doing that this semester, so I'd be happy to talk about it and answer questions about that opportunity in the discussion. So now switching gears and talking about funding. So our funding here at UVA as PhD students really comes from two different sources. One is from our stipend being TAs, and the other part is from the Fellowship for Research. Now, there's also a graduate research assistantship, which is the GRA, and oftentimes if your PI that you're working with has a large grant, then they can facilitate your stipend funding instead of doing a TA-ship. And so it kind of alleviate the responsibility from teaching so that you can focus on research for that semester. That really varies from PI to PI. And so that's a potential opportunity, but typically your funding comes from either your TA-ship or your Fellowship for Research. And then kind of as you're in first and second year, you can start to apply for external fellowships as well as internal fellowships at the university of your choosing. Some of those external fellowships are things like the National Science Foundation Fellowship, the Ford Foundation Fellowship, and then an internal fellowship specifically at UVA is the Jefferson Scholars Foundation Fellowship. And those would, again, help to alleviate some of the hours towards teaching so that more of your hours can go towards research. And so talking a little bit now about departmental committees. So at UVA within the psychology department, we have a number of different committees. Our committee structure has actually changed a little bit in response to the pandemic. And so now we have a couple of different task force that are really focused on a number of different kind of needs relevant to the pandemic. The first is COVID era teaching, so teaching online and remote as well as hybrid courses. So we have a committee that looks at instructional support and digital pedagogies, classroom health and safety, and evaluation of teaching and learning in this new environment. And then our second task force is around research support during this time. So safety, being able to collaborate with the human participants, research, and the IRB, the participant pool, as well as a statistics consultant through the quantitative area. And then task force 3 is really around graduate concerns and action plans. Here, this encompasses graduate training, graduate student well-being, and graduate student celebrations, as well as social activities. And then our task force 4 is undergraduate programs. So that includes enhancing diversity, undergraduate programs and curriculum, COVID era engagement and belonging, Read Symposium, which is an undergraduate research conference, as well as science outreach in the local community, which is really great to see. And then we have a couple of committees that don't necessarily fall under some of those task force, but have continued their work. The Diversity and Inclusion Committee, the Psychology Buildings Representatives, as we're going through a bit of a transition now and our buildings being renovated. A colloquium committee, so that's when our entire department gets together to listen to a talk from a leader in the field, typically from a different university. We also have a committee for our psychology department newsletter, our webpage, and our social media presence. We also have graduate student council reps. So there's a broader graduate student council across different departments. So we have a few representatives that represent our kind of psychology department needs and interests. Then we also have a newsletter committee, as well as a professional issues committee, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality committee, and a social committee, as well as teaching representatives in each of the areas. So we have a lot of different departmental committees to get involved in to do service within a number of different areas. And so now switching gears to the first year experience. So there will be a number of different responsibilities, and a student in general theme is you're wearing a lot of different and exhilarating, and can also be challenging at times. So within the first year, you'll have coursework. So that'll be about 12 units per semester, which is typically about 2 or 3 classes. You'll attend your area lunch. So you'll have a speaker series for speakers within your particular area of psychology, and then you'll attend all of the department colloquia. And then you'll also be starting your own research, so initiating projects in at least one lab, attending lab meetings for your lab and potentially others, and starting to collaborate with faculty mentors on how to get started doing research in the lab. And then for teaching, most students will TA each semester, so both their fall and their spring semester, and that's typically introductory level courses. And then you'll also be involved potentially in service in some of those different departmental committees that I just walked through. And there aren't any deadlines here at UVA for your first year, but it's definitely recommended that you start working and kind of collaborating and starting to brainstorm ideas for your master's thesis, which is due at the end of the second year summer and kind of the beginning of the third year. And then I also include a slide here just on the first year experience specifically for clinical students. And so it's going to look a little bit different from the other areas. And so I just leave this here as a resource, and I'd be happy to talk about this more in further detail during the discussion. The additional component is really, in addition to research and teaching, you're also learning how to be a clinician and getting involved in some of your first clinical work. But thanks so much. Looking forward to the discussion. I'll pass it on now to our next presenter, Diane Joe.
Thank you, Shannon. That was great. And as I mentioned before, we'll be planning to try and share all these slides with participants as well. And I think that's a great snapshot of just the additional responsibilities that clinical students have. It's a good thing to be mindful, especially for students who are applying to clinical programs. So thank you, Shannon. Diane Joe, we'll have you up next to talk more about grad student life. If you don't mind starting your video and unmuting.
All right, can everyone hear me and see me? I think so.
Yes, perfect.
Great, all right, thank you so much, Noelle. Hi everyone, my name is Diane Joe Bart-Plonge. I'm excited to be here with you today. And I am a fifth year in the social psychology area, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm just going to be talking to you today about more about graduate student life. So graduate student life part 2, if you will. All right, so first I just want to talk a bit about having a work-life balance in graduate school. It's something that is really important for being in school. So graduate school can be a really rewarding experience, and you learn a lot during that time period and you produce a lot of work, but it can also be it's also pretty stressful as well, and it's new and difficult. So having a work-life balance and prioritizing that and your own health is of utmost importance. Unfortunately, graduate students suffer from higher rates of anxiety and depression, so really taking care of your mental health is really important. So part of the reason why grad school can be pretty stressful is because you have your schedule is completely different than what it was like when you were an undergrad, particularly after your first 2 years or 3 years when you don't have coursework anymore and you're mainly just working on research. So all of that unstructured time and just the difficulty of research in general can be really strange to navigate. It can be difficult to plan your time or figure out exactly what you're supposed to be doing day to day. So really that making a schedule for yourself that's consistent, scheduling what time you're going to wake up in the morning and start your work and what time you're going to finish and go off and do other things is really important. Taking breaks and days off is important as well. So schedule a time every week where you're not going to work at all and you're going to either spend time by yourself, relax, hang out with friends, and all of that. So all of that is going to be really important for your mental and physical health, just keeping a solid routine. And that's going to keep you on track for your research as well. So if you don't have a planner, getting one for grad school is going to be really helpful. So I always try and remember the 3 E's. It's something I learned in undergrad, that eat, sleep, and exercise. Always make sure that you're doing those 3 things, no matter what is going on. Schedule times to do all 3 of those things throughout your time in grad school, and that's going to help you maintain a schedule, help you maintain your physical and your mental health. Now, therapy is something that you might not get to talk too much about or think too much about prior to going to grad school. But it can be a really important resource and tool that you might want to utilize or might need to utilize while you're there. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit too when I'm talking about work-life balance and taking care of your mental health. So know that therapy can be beneficial or is beneficial to everyone, no matter what you're going through. So even when you're going through like a good time in grad school, you're doing just fine. You have a great social life, you're doing well in your research, just using therapy, thinking of therapy as a maintenance for your own mental health, making sure that you're on track is a good thing to do. So even if you're doing just fine, going to therapy, talking with a therapist can help you figure out coping mechanisms for times when grad school gets more stressful, more difficult, especially when you're working on your thesis or you're working on your dissertation. Those are times where your stress levels are going to be higher and you might need that extra support. So those are good things to keep in mind as well. Looking for a therapist early on, keeping some numbers down, some recommendations down, so that you can use that when you end up needing it. So move on to building community. Yeah, so like all aspects of graduate school, building community can be challenging, but also is really rewarding once you, if you put in the effort to do that. So early on, I think it's really important to start making friends outside of your area and outside of your department, and of course, inside of your department. Because being in graduate school is a lot different than your undergraduate experience. I think as an undergrad, it can be much easier to make friends. Everyone is usually in like pretty close proximity to one another. People are often the same age and everyone's looking for new friends. So the way you make friends in undergrad might be like really smooth and easy. It's a lot different in grad school, and you need to be more intentional about that often. So connecting yourself to the new community that you're in is a really important part of beginning grad school, and then also maintaining friendships outside of it. So exploring the city with members of your cohort or by yourself is a great thing to do as soon as you come in, like pretty early on. Looking up places online that fit your interests, or start cultivating new interests that are social, can help you to make new connections. What's great about grad school is you can make friends inside of your department, inside of your cohort, but you also want to make sure that you have friends outside of that too, so that your entire life isn't graduate school. That's going to be important for your mental health. So I really recommend joining a club, an interest group, starting in an intramural sport if you're into that, a book club, dance classes, etc. Any of those things that are in the surrounding community to build ties to the school that you're going to now and the surrounding community that you're living in. So for me, I know that I started salsa dancing when I got to UVA, like in my second year or so, and that helped me. That helped me with my sense of belonging in Charlottesville, and it helped me make a lot of new friends that I wouldn't have made otherwise. So it's all a part of building community, building a support system that's inside and outside of your department too, so that you feel like you're at home. And you can make your school at home in your new city. So grad students can also struggle sometimes with a sense of belonging on your campus. It's a lot easier to cultivate that sense of belonging when you're an undergraduate student. Usually things around the university are more geared toward undergrads anyway, to help you have that sense of belonging at your school. So I think some things that are important to think about when you get to grad school are trying to build ties to your campus so you can cultivate that sense of belonging that's going to help your well-being while you're here and benefit your life. So using different public spaces on campus, I think, is pretty important to be able to do that. So in the era of COVID, that's going to look a bit different, but I don't necessarily mean spaces indoors, but you can also like take time to take walks around your campus. So not just going to your one building and going home all the time, only knowing that one building on campus, but taking the time to explore different parts of campus, really get to know it, sit outside different places, explore new places on campus. I think it's really good to foster that sense of belonging, an important thing to do. And lastly, I'll talk a little bit about budgeting and living too. So stipends for graduate school are just going to vary from school to school quite a bit. So paying attention to this when you're applying to school and when you're choosing a school is really important, because it's definitely going to have an impact on your life. I know many of our other panelists have already mentioned paying attention to that stipend and seeing what it is. So if you're moving somewhere with a very high cost of living, then you want to pay more attention to that stipend, pay attention to housing costs around the area, and research whether or not graduate students in that program are able to live comfortably on the stipend that they have, or whether or not they end up having to supplement their income by working other jobs and whatnot. That's going to be really important for that's going to be really important to know, to figure out whether or not this school is the right place for you to be. Because grad school is already stressful, so having added stress of you know, having enough money to pay your rent and buy food and live comfortably is something you're really going to want to keep in mind. Think about whether or not you want roommates or living by yourself. So if you're going to live by yourself, your stipend matters even more, because it's more expensive to do that. And one thing I wish I would have thought about more when I was thinking about student life going to grad school are the unexpected costs that you might not budget for. So some places that you live might require you to have renter's insurance. Renter's insurance is a good thing to have anyway, but you could have unexpected costs like being required to have renter's insurance, parking costs. So if you end up living a little bit farther away from campus to save a little bit of money, like no matter where you're going to live, because usually the closer you are to campus, the more expensive your housing is going to be. You might end up having to drive somewhere nearby campus and park, and those parking costs for universities can end up being very expensive and can be an unexpected expense that you weren't planning on paying. Pet fees and such, if you have a pet or end up getting a pet, always end up being extra money that you may not have budgeted for, unexpected visits to the vet's office. So all of those things are good things to keep in mind when you are budgeting your living expenses. And there's a lot of different ways that you can keep yourself on track. So there's one website, I should have put it on the slide actually, but it's easy to remember, mint.com. That's what I use. I'm sure there's other budgeting websites like that, but mint.com is one way that I keep myself on a budget and make sure that I have enough money to keep to do all my expenses. So that helps me figure out how much I'm able to spend on entertainment, on clothes, on food, and helps me budget all of my necessities as well. So when you have that stipend, making sure that it can go a long way by keeping yourself on a budget is really important for, you know, your student life as well. And with that, I think that's all I have actually. Yep. So I will turn it over to Kaden.
Thanks, Diane Jo. That was great. And I know there's a couple of questions about mental health services, so we'll come back to those during the Q&A. And Kaden will be speaking with you all about disability and graduate school applications. So kind of reviewing some content, even from our first panel, talking specifically through a lens of disability, and then we'll also be talking about selection of grad school through that same lens. So Kaden, if you don't mind starting your video and unmuting.
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
All right, great. Hi, my name is Kaden Stockwell. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm in the Jaswell lab here at UVA, and I study autistic social interaction. I just finished my first year in the developmental area, and I'm currently on medical leave, so sort of an awkward what year am I question. So like Noah said, I'm going to backtrack a little bit to cover the application process, but I'll also address program selection at the end. And I'm going to encourage you to stay engaged with the topics that I'm talking about, even if you don't currently have a disability. Disability can be acquired or diagnosed at any point, and it can change, its impact on you can change depending on the expectations currently presented in your life. So even if you're thinking that this might not apply to you, I encourage you to still sort of attend and at least think about the information in case a friend might need it. All right, so the first point that often comes up when thinking about disability is disclosure. So thinking about, am I going to tell this potential advisor or this program that I have a disability? And the first sort of decision point that often comes up with this is during an initial email that you might send to a potential advisor, checking if they're taking students that cycle or if your research interests match up. My general advice for this point is to wait until later in the application process, when you have maybe decided that this really is a program that's of interest to you, or you've built up a little bit of rapport with this person you're talking to. People tend to disclose a little bit more at the point of the personal statement or the diversity statement. And you might decide to disclose in some of the schools you're applying to, but not to others. It's always something that's up to you. I find that I think I disclosed in, 4 of the 10 applications that I sent out, and I made that decision to disclose in the statement because for those 4 schools, when I had spoken and emailed with the advisors, they had seemed very supportive generally, and or their work specifically addressed disability. Or when I disclosed for schools that asked about diversity statements, most of my work in undergrad had been related to supporting disabled and queer students, so it was relevant to talk about. If you do decide to disclose in an application statement, my general advice is to sort of frame positively and do it from a growth perspective. So you can think about keywords such as perseverance, you're a problem solver, you might be adaptable. And you can talk about it not so much necessarily from an overcoming perspective, but more from these are the challenges I've faced, and because I've faced these challenges, I now have these skills, or I have this perspective when I think about research problems, and always sort of trying to tie it back into your research interests and your research fit for this advisor. Additionally, if your disability is part of why you're interested in your field, it was for me, you can say that can be part of the story that you're telling about your research interests. I wouldn't spend a great deal of time on it, but it is something that can be part of your statement as your lived experience. And I think it was brought up a little bit in the application section, but if there's something that might be considered unusual about your path to graduate school, or something on your transcripts like GPA that might be considered a quote unquote red flag, you can explain that. If, for example, you were in the hospital a lot one semester, or you are having issues with your accommodations being appropriately fulfilled, taking a little bit of space in your personal statement or having a recommendation letter writer address that can give faculty more insight than just the numbers that might be showing up on your transcripts. And again, I would just advise, however you choose to address that, to frame it positively and focus more on how you've grown and the things you've gained from that experience than specifically on the challenges or the limits of that experience. The next stage tends to be interviews. So if you've received an interview invite, congratulations, take some time to celebrate that, because that's an accomplishment in and of itself. And this is often another point of decision-making about if you want to disclose your disability. If you think you're going to need accommodations for the interview, such as you might need an ASL interpreter, or you don't think you're going to be able to walk the distances if there's a campus tour, this might be less of an issue for if we're having Zoom interviews, for example. But it may be better to disclose at this point and secure those accommodations for the interview than try and struggle through without them. You don't have to be specific when you're doing this request. It can be a very simple email, such as I have a disability and I'm going to need an ASL interpreter for the interview process to be accessible to me. So it can really just focus on, this is what I need for this interview to be accessible, and how can we work together to get this set up. And something important that I like to note is when you're at the interview, schools or representatives of the school, such as professors or grad students, shouldn't be asking you about your disability status, even if your disability is visible. It's always up to you whether you want to disclose your disability. Some people may not know that they're not supposed to ask, and it's not so much a politeness issue, it's more of a disability as a protected status issue. So some people don't know that they shouldn't be asking. But if someone does ask you, you can always, it's your choice if you want to address the question. If you would prefer not to, you can always directly shut the question down and say that you prefer to talk about something else. Or you can sort of pivot it to get to answer questions that you had about the program, and sort of refocus the conversation to something you'd prefer to talk about. And the interview is just as much about you interviewing the school and the program as it is as they are interviewing you. So make sure you get the information that you need to make sure that this is the right advisor and the right program for you. You can always email to ask questions that come up later or that you've forgotten about, but it does tend to be easier to get that information at the initial interview. So if you have a disability, you might have some specific questions that non-disabled prospective students might not be thinking about. It might be really important for you to think about the insurance that your school offers, or you might need proximity to a major hospital or specific kinds of medical providers. It might be good to know your department's attitude about mental health and how freely students feel that they can talk about mental health with their advisor or with their peers. You might also be looking at, is there a disability community on campus or in the local area? And examining like the physical environment of the university, which can be a little bit harder over Zoom. So that might be specific questions you ask or going on sort of a virtual tour through Google Maps. So looking at, is it a super hilly environment if you have a mobility issue? I'd also encourage you to ask about the parking. If walking is an issue for you, having parking can be important, and some universities parking is a very sort of limited thing that you can have. So check about that. And then once you've been accepted, that's great, congratulations, take some time to celebrate. At this point, you have to decide, am I going to accept an offer at all? And if you have multiple offers, how do you pick which one is the right one for you? I like to point out that once you have that formal letter or formal email of acceptance, you have a little bit more power than you had previously, and you have a little bit more security in terms of if you decide to disclose your disability status, if you haven't at this point. And so at this point, you can disclose a little bit more safely. And accessibility may also be a factor in your decision-making process, like those questions that I talked about to ask on an interview. It may be a factor even if you don't want it to be, and it's okay to have feelings about that. It's also okay to be frustrated if you've received an offer for a university that you've realized is just not going to be accessible for you. The ADA has been the law for 30 years now, and some universities are still sort of working to become in compliance with that. So one of the ways that you can help yourself make this decision is to ask if there's a disabled grad student you could email or talk with. There may not be, but in my opinion, it doesn't hurt to ask. That can give you a lot of insight into what it's like to be a disabled student at that university. I also encourage any prospective student, but especially disabled prospective students, to look through your program's handbook and the graduate school's handbook. So here that would be UVA Psychology's handbook, and then the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences handbook. And look for things about accommodations, about the Disabled Student Center. I encourage people to look at the medical and the personal leave policies in case something happens where you need to take some time off. And those are also policies that tend to be related to time off you could take if you become a parent during grad school. And again, finding out what the health insurance situation. And another thing that I encourage you to do, if you haven't already at the point that you've received an acceptance, is to take a look at the disabled students website, see how easy it is for you to navigate. Is it easy to find sort of what documentation you would need if you were going to seek formal accommodations? A good thing to look for is, do they specifically address graduate students and accommodations? For example, you might find that you need different things for when you are a student in a class compared to when you're teaching a class or when you're doing lab work. And not all disability service offices know how to navigate those different roles that graduate students fill. And you can always email this office with questions at any stage in the process. If you've not disclosed to your program or it's earlier in the application process and you're worried about disclosing, one thing that I did was I made an anonymous email with just a different name, and I used that email to get questions from the Disability Services Office. And so that can give you a little bit of security about your anonymity if you're still feeling nervous about disclosing. The biggest thing I want to highlight is it's your choice if and when you disclose. And my personal preference based on my experience is to at least disclose and register with the Disability Students Office so that you have a formal record in case you need support. You don't ever have to use it, but it's easier in my experience to be registered and not use the accommodations than it is to get to a point where you're really struggling and not have a formal support system set up. And so if any questions came up as part of what I've talking about, or if things come up later about applying as a disabled or queer student, feel free to email me. Thank you.
Hayden, that was excellent. Thank you so much. All right, we have one final presentation, which will be Janelle and Alexis, who will be talking to us about some of the DE&I initiatives in the department, and then we will come back to the full panel to do some Q&A. So please, if you do have other questions you want to add into the Q&A tab, we are keeping track of those. And I will turn it over to Alexis and Janelle. If you can both start your video and unmute, please.
Okay. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Trying to find my mouse. Okay. So hi everyone. Hi again. I'll reintroduce myself really quickly, but my name is Alexis Stanton. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a third-year graduate student in the community psychology program. And I also serve as the graduate student director of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the psychology department.
And hello, everyone. My name is Janelle Billingsley. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm a 5th year in the community area.
Okay. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that we have going on in the department. And so as a department, we've really been reevaluating our admissions process and trying to move toward a more holistic admissions model. And so as a part of this shift, we've made a couple of changes that we just want to put on your radar as you're potentially thinking about applying to our program. So for example, we have removed the GRE requirement for the next 5 years, which is a change that is in alignment with many other departments at UVA and also other psychology departments at some of our peer institutions, who are really just responding to the multitude of diversity, equity, and inclusion access concerns that sort of come up and that are associated with the GRE specifically and standardized testing more broadly. Another change that we've made is that we have added a DE&I prompt to our graduate admissions materials that all applicants will be asked to respond to. So I'm going to show you that really quickly. So I won't read all of it. I know that this is a lot on the screen, but I'll just give you some time to review it, and I will also point out some key parts. So the first bolded part says all members of our department have a shared responsibility to foster an inclusive environment. And this is really getting at the purpose of the prompt. And so we really just want to communicate the expectation to all applicants and prospective students that DE&I is something that we take very seriously in the department. And we want to set the expectation or the norm that everyone has a role to play in fostering an inclusive environment. And so this is not just, a few students of color getting together and doing this work, but really everyone making sure that we're fostering an inclusive space. The second part that's bolded says that contributions to inclusive excellence may come in the form of research topic, research population, clinical volunteer work, professional service, personal perspective, and more. And this part is really just to model for students all of the different ways that we can engage in DE&I work. And of course, this is not restrictive or exhaustive, but we just want to highlight that there are many different ways to be engaged in creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive space. The last part that I'll talk about says, we are not asking you to disclose aspects of your identity. So this is a really important part. And we just want to make it clear that you're not required to disclose aspects of your identities here. You can do so if you want to, and if you feel that it's relevant to do so, but we're not requiring that you do that. And we really just want to hear more about the educational, professional, and personal experiences that have prepared you to really contribute to inclusive excellence during your graduate career. Okay, so another change that we are implementing is to recognize graduate student contributions to DE&I in our annual reports. So as a graduate student, at the end of every year, we're reporting back to our advisors and the department on what we have accomplished professionally throughout the academic year. So this is a really good time for you to indicate, what kind of coursework you've completed, any publications that you have, conferences that you've attended, service that you're engaged in. And these are all sort of expectations that the department and your advisor has of you as a graduate student that you're consistently doing every year. And so by adding this DE&I requirement, we're sort of, again, setting the expectation and norm that all graduate students are playing a role in enhancing DE&I. And I want to note, it's not just like DE&I as a separate sphere, but really integrating DE&I into all of the work that we're already doing as graduate students, right? So adding it to the existing categories of like publishing and research and service. So this is something that is really important, and we're excited to see the ways that this will help foster all graduate students participating in DE&I work. Okay, so the final DE&I initiative that I'll talk about is that we have a faculty and graduate student excellence DE&I award that we have 2 awards that we created, one at the faculty level and one at the graduate student level. And we created these awards because we really want to ensure that we are recognizing and celebrating the efforts being made by those in our community to advance DE&I in their teaching and their research and their service, et cetera. And so more information about these awards can be found on our website under the diversity tab, but we just wanted to make you aware that this is something new that we're doing. And again, we're just really invested in setting the norm that all students are participating, and that those who are engaging in DE&I excellence should be getting awarded and compensated for their work. Okay, so now I'm going to transition into talking a little bit about how to get involved in DE&I work in the department. So we have a bunch of DE&I subcommittees. And so as you can see, all of them are listed here. I'm just going to talk about one, and then Janelle will sort of tackle the other subcommittees. But the one that I'd like to point out is the curriculum subcommittee. And something I guess that I should note before jumping into that is that all of these are graduate student led subcommittees. There are faculty who are on the subcommittees as well, but we're really sort of making sure that graduate students are at the forefront of these subcommittees and sort of leading the charge. And so, for example, we have the curriculum subcommittee, which has been tasked with using a DE&I lens to review the current graduate student curriculum and to provide feedback and initiatives to enhance that curriculum. So we're really interested in what graduate students think about the classes that they're required to take. And we're always interested in getting feedback about what's good about those classes, maybe what's not so good, and how we can improve those courses moving forward, or perhaps add new courses that fit best with graduate students' needs. Other things that people on the subcommittee might be working on are reviewing faculty syllabi and identifying opportunities to improve the syllabi, and paying special attention to issues of racial and social justice. So yeah, that is a really interesting subcommittee. It's relatively new. I think they're doing really important work. And I'm going to turn it over to Janelle to talk a little bit more about the undergrad outreach, undergrad data, and graduate data subcommittees.
Thank you, Alexis. So we have both an undergraduate and graduate data subcommittee. And I'd say for both of these subcommittees, there's a lot of work that's happening to collect data from both undergraduate and graduate students to better understand patterns of representation among the students in our department. These subcommittees are also interested in collecting data to understand the experiences and outcomes of our graduate and undergraduate students in the department. And the thought is that this info could then be used to possibly increase the representation that we're seeing within our department. And then we have undergraduate outreach as well. And so outreach is doing some work with the undergraduate data subcommittee to learn a little bit more about students' experiences in the department, and again, how that information can be used to inform some of our outreach efforts. But we're also really interested in supporting our students who are currently in the department. And so we are working on some programming to provide info on how students can both gain research experience, but also maximize those experiences. And again, since we know how important this is for graduate preparation. Something else that I'll kind of throw out there is that, I am on the undergraduate outreach subcommittee, and we're planning to also hold open office hours in the spring for students to just drop in and talk to grad students on a weekly basis. And so we're really hoping to build connection among our underrepresented graduate students and undergraduate students, especially if those students aren't already in a lab with those graduate students. So we want to make sure that that space is available for students to get some support. Right, and Alexis, you can go to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So other opportunities to get involved in leadership. Earlier, Shannon touched on this very briefly, and I'll just add a little bit more. So we do have our Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Committee, another student-led initiative. And we do call it REGS for short. And so REGS is really a space for graduate students to come together to discuss and address issues related to race, gender, sexuality representation, and support in the department. It does differ a little bit from some of the DE&I initiatives in that those are student-led, but there's faculty involvement as well, whereas this is a space that's protected for graduate students to come together and support and work through without that faculty presence there, because we know that can be important as well to have that separate space. And so we do have that subcommittee as well. In the past, we have organized recruitment events at the graduate level, but I will say that one of our most successful initiatives that has originated from REGS is what's now UVA's annual Diversifying Scholarship Conference. And so I won't say too much on it here, since again, Shannon, who spoke earlier, is a co-chair for the conference and can say more during Q&A. But I will highlight that back in the spring of 2017, the REGS committee did put together a proposal to fund what has now become this annual conference that does provide a platform for interdisciplinary collaboration among scholars conducting research on issues of power, privilege, and oppression. And so it's been really nice. It's been really nice to have this platform for folks to present work and make these connections. And I will also kind of throw out there that I believe the 2021 conference will be held in early April, and that abstract submissions are now open. And again, if you all have questions about this, it would be virtual. So that can come up more in the Q&A if you all are interested, but wanted to throw that out there. You can go to the next slide, Alexis. Okay. Another initiative that our department is heavily involved in is our Leadership Alliance program. And so for the past 4 summers, members of our department have welcomed talented groups of underrepresented students to participate in an intensive research summer training experience. And so what you see here are pictures from our last 3 cohorts of students. And so over the course of 8 weeks, students are paid to work for 40 hours a week in research labs and attend professional development development trainings that are meant to prepare them for graduate level research and writing. And so along with a faculty advisor, graduate students in the department are able to serve as these students' student mentors, graduate student mentors, which kind of coincides with helping them prepare final research papers and presentations that will be showcased at a national summer research conference. And so having led the professional development workshops myself for the past 3 years, as well as having mentored students in the program, I can say that my involvement as a graduate student with our Leadership Alliance program has been one of my personal highlights of my graduate training experience. And so I definitely recommend others to get involved, whether it be mentoring students, leading sessions in our professional development workshop, or maybe like one day actually leading the workshop since I won't always be here. So I definitely recommend people to get involved. And you can go one more slide. And then last but not least, what I did want to put on you all's radar is a new opportunity coming from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, which does house our psychology department. And so applications are now being accepted for students interested in joining the fall 2021 cohort of what is the Bridge to the Doctoral Fellows program. And so this program seeks to support underrepresented post-bac students looking to get additional training and research experience prior to applying to a doctoral program. And so the program does provide 2 full years of financial support and allows students to take courses and participate in guided research opportunities, as well as professional development. And it does seem as though that fellows can complete either a graduate certificate, a master's degree, or advance into a doctoral program at UVA. So overall, it seems like a really great opportunity to look into to have on you all's radar. And also the deadline is March 1st, 2021. That's it. Yep, so thank you all. If you have questions, direct questions, definitely email.
Thank you both so much, and all the panelists. If you don't mind, Mina, Mara, Shannon, Diane, Joe, Kaden, Alexis, and Janelle, stay on, and we'll all start our videos and unmute. And so I know we're running a little over on time. I don't know if we're all going to get kicked out at 6:30. I hope not. But if you have to go at 6:30, that's okay too. But we'll try and stay for those who can stay a little longer if there's questions. Change the view here. All right. And so I wanted to start. I know there was one question, and I saw Diane Joe did try and respond to it in the chat. But I also wanted to ask Shannon if you would speak to this a little bit as well, because I know the clinical area has a liaison in particular. The issue around seeking mental health services is such an important one, and there are kind of some unique aspects of that for clinical students. So Shannon, would you feel comfortable speaking to that briefly, just what the liaison does and kind of what some of those challenges are and how we're trying to deal with that as a department?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important topic to discuss. I'm glad that it came up. Through the university, so as a graduate student, a PhD student at UVA, you receive a fully paid insurance program through Aetna Student Health. And through that, there are a number of different resources for somewhat more affordable mechanisms for receiving mental health services. And additionally, through that, you're also able to go to our counseling and psychological services at UVA, which is known as CAPS to UVA students. And they use a brief model through CAPS, which is typically around 6 to 8 sessions focused on a specific area of interest. But they're also really great and have excellent care managers, which help with referrals into the community to find more affordable and long-term services for mental health care. Through the department, we also have a training clinic called the Mary Ainsworth Clinic, in which clinical students actually do their training in assessment and in therapy. Those are free resources and free mental health services to folks in the broader Charlottesville community. So those are a couple of different resources, definitely something that we're really mindful of, and the clinical liaison works one-on-one with graduate students to find affordable mental health services in the Charlottesville community. Right now, through Aetna Health Insurance, there's actually a reduction in copays and free copays for the first 4 or 5 sessions related to pandemic stress and anxiety, which is really great to see, and I hope that that continues. But happy to discuss that more and could go on and on about different mental health care services.
Super helpful, thank you. And thanks, Diane Jo, for emphasizing just the importance of seeking mental health care services during graduate school, and just acknowledging that we are seeing elevated levels of anxiety and depression in graduate students, just more generally, not necessarily specifically in psychology. Okay, let me ask one question from earlier, and then I'm going to look to see the new question in the chat. For any of you, could you talk about, assuming that maybe you were trying to decide between several different programs, could you talk about maybe the 1 or 2 top factors in helping you make your final decision? I think we've covered a lot of different elements of grad student experience, and Diane Jo, you talked importantly about finances and other factors. So this is open to anyone. And Kaden, I know you talked about specifically, awareness in terms of accessibility and mentorship and so forth. So could folks, anyone can get us started, but just talking about what was that, 1 or 2 primary factor in helping you make your decision?
I could speak a little bit on that. So the 3 most important factors for me when I was deciding where to go were 1, the stipend, 2, the environment, like what it felt like in the department to be around all the graduate students and the professors. And then I'm blanking on the 3rd. The fit with your advisor, which has been mentioned multiple times. So your advisor can really make or break your experience. That's the person you're going to be spending the most time with. So that's always to keep at the utmost importance. You want to be sure that your advisor is someone that you can work with. They will probably ask you questions about what your preferred mentoring style is, and you should pay attention to those answers and ask those questions yourself. And you also want to see how you can work with that person, and if you're able to work with other people around the department too. And I paid a lot of attention to how the grad students felt or acted on campus when I was there on the campus visits. It's a little different when you're dealing with COVID restrictions, so you might have a lot of interviews that are through video instead. But I wanted to see if the grad students seem to like each other, enjoy each other's company. They don't all have to hang out together, but for it to be a positive environment was really important for me. Luckily, I have a sister who went through graduate school too in a psychology program. So through her, I knew that grad school has a lot of different stressors. So the better environment you could be in, the better life is going to be for you. So paying attention to how happy the graduate students are, how happy they are to engage with you. Usually happier grad students are excited to have new people on campus. And of course the stipend. That's important too for obvious reasons, but if you're going to be supporting yourself and you're going to be in a place that has a very high cost of living compared to where you are before, that's you're gonna want to have a stipend that's going to allow you to live without having to get a second job.
For me, I was indecisive and definitely came down to the last minute. I think I made my decision on April 14th and the deadline is April 15th. Sorry to my advisor. But no, for me, it really came down to, I liked both of my potential advisors. They both seemed individually very supportive, skilled in their field, they had the knowledge and the means to support my development. But the deciding factor was UVA. I felt supported by my potential advisor and by the broader developmental area and the broader psychology department. It seemed like everybody that I interviewed with or talked with all sort of gave off that air of being supportive and sort of interested in what I was doing and what I wanted to get out of the program compared to at the offer that I ended up turning down. The PI seemed supportive, but the broader area and department didn't feel very welcoming. And so I figured that I would rather, because this was going to be intellectually challenging, I also wanted to be sort of supported more as a person. And I felt like UVA's department was better equipped to do that than the offer that I ended up turning down.
Anybody else want to add anything?
I think Mara brought this up when she was presenting, but I would just kind of echo being mindful of where your potential advisor is at in their career. I think that was something that was that helped sell me, is just being mindful of that. And it's pretty good because the other person maybe I was considering to work with, they're now like doing in an administrative role full time. And so I'm still in graduate school. So that would have impacted me had maybe I'd made that decision. So I would just really be mindful of kind of the trajectory that advisor is also on and how that would factor into your timeline as well.
And I see we also have a question here in the chat or in the Q&A function, asking a little bit more about fellowships. And so I know we've touched on these a little bit and mentioned that there are, different ways of kind of being funded, mentioning NSF and Ford and some of these mechanisms. I do think it is important to acknowledge that those are fairly competitive. We wouldn't want to make it seem that those are kind of automatic. I think UVA, has a pretty good track record. We do have a pretty decent success rate for the whole department for our students who apply. But does anybody want to say a little bit more? I mean, we certainly have plenty of students who do not get those, who maybe don't even apply for those fellowships, or who apply and don't get those fellowships. And certainly some students have mentioned already how sometimes faculty might get a grant and then they might, we call it buying out, but it's like, using that grant funding to support the student's stipend in place of a teaching assistantship. So that happens to some extent too, but there's certainly students who will be here without those fellowships or kind of external funding mechanisms through faculty. So they're certainly, we don't mean to suggest, that it's not a kind of sustainable experience here if you don't have a fellowship. I don't know if there's anything else folks want to add to make sure we're answering that question.
I have one that's sort of related in that if you are not a permanent resident in the US, you're ineligible to apply for, Ford or any of the NSFs or NIMH foundations, like fellowships or grants. And so actually one thing that was important when I was doing my grad school research and deciding on schools was to see if the schools had internal fellowships for students to apply to, because those, it's like if you're a member of that institution, you can apply for. And some schools, they vary a lot in terms of the fellowships opportunities for grad students. So that's something to look out for.
Yeah, that's a super important point as well, in terms of just limitations and challenges that will not face all students the same way. And so, yeah, certainly looking into eligibility and learning more about that. And I think NSF continuously the National Science Foundation has changed several times. At first you could apply multiple times. Now you can only apply once. And you used to be able to apply in your first or second year. I think now you can only apply in your first year of grad school. So, it's like, these kinds of fellowship programs, it's good to start looking into them early, just to know if you are eligible and if you may want to apply. But certainly, I think Diane Joe's point earlier, just about, you want to know what the funding is, and you want to make sure that whatever funding is being offered to you through the department is doable, right? Or at least factor that in if you're comparing other offers that you might have, because you don't ever want to go in just like with the assumption that you'll get a fellowship or you'll get outside off. So you want to say, if nothing else did work out, would the package that is being offered, potentially work for me? So I think let's round up with one last question, which I think would be really helpful. And I know, we're doing a panel for students who are just now applying to grad school and kind of thinking about that. But I also think it could be really helpful for them to hear from you all what you think you'd like to do after grad school. Like, what do you feel like this grad school training is gonna, kind of help prepare you for? Because it can also, I talk to students a lot about when you're applying, think about what you might want to do when you finish, and then choose a program that you think is most going to prepare you to be able to do that thing. So if we could just kind of wrap up on that note with folks. And I know even in grad school, we don't always have this all figured out, but if you could kind of talk about some of the directions that you might be considering, I think that can be helpful, because students should be kind of thinking about, grad school is a means to an end. So you want to think about, what is the program, what is the kind of training I'll receive, and how will that help me to pursue whatever career goals I might have. And we can start with, maybe we'll start with Shannon, and then Alexis, and then Janelle. Does that?
Yeah, so one thing within our clinical psychology program is that we are known for it being around 50% preparation for research and 50% preparation for clinical work. What that often feels like is 100% towards research and 100% towards clinical work, but I really have loved the research that I've conducted, and as well as some teaching opportunities and the clinical work that I do. And so absolutely, academia is probably my first choice as a tenure track professor, but I can also see working in a kind of hospital type setting and providing clinical services. Those are, we'll see where it takes me.
Great.
Okay, I'm next, right? So I'm in the community area, and I came into graduate school being really open to either staying in the academy or working outside of it. I'm coming in with my master's in public health. And so it was really important to me to choose a program that, like community, has an applied focus. And so, yeah, for me, I'm still not completely sure, but I'm open to both. A lot of people in our program stay in the academy or in academia. Some people are working in industry. Other folks are working for the government. So there are a lot of options, and I'm still trying to figure it all out. I'm open.
Thank you. Janelle?
Yeah, so as I said, I'm a 5th year, so this question is very present in my mind. But I've been consistent from undergrad coming into graduate school that I do want to go into the academy. And so I would say, and this might have been highlighted already, but a real benefit of this program, I would say, is that going back to, so half of our stipend comes from our TA-ship, but there's pretty much like a cap about like 10 hours, 7 to 10 hours that you're spending on TAing, which is not overwhelming by any means. So that does allow a good amount of time, especially as a community student. Of course, with clinical, it's a bit different. But as a community student, there's a lot of time there that I can focus on my research, which will make me more competitive applying to faculty positions. And so that is my goal, and that's what I'll be pursuing.
Thank you. And then how about Diane Jo, and then Mara, and then Mina, and then Kaden? I'm just going in the order that you're in my Zoom squares.
Yeah, so like Janelle said, I'm also a 5th year. So this question is like, has been on my mind for a long time, and especially now. But actually, similar to Janelle, I've wanted to go into the academy. That was my plan when I graduated from undergrad and was applying to graduate school. So that's what I'm hoping to do. But since going into graduate school, I have become more open to the possibility of not doing that, and maybe doing something in policy as well. So it's pretty up in the air, but academia would still be my first choice. I think with having an advisor that's in the public policy school and the psychology department helps me think of different options for what I could possibly do, and be okay with that, and not necessarily going into academia.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to say something really similar to DJ. I think when I first entered grad school, the idea was that I was going to go through and then do a postdoc and then apply for faculty positions and try to do research at a university. Since then, I've kind of I've opened up my my opportunities, I guess, and the places that I look for opportunities in other areas. I think I've been considering maybe doing data analysis work after I leave. It seems like there's a lot of jobs available in that area. And it's something that I enjoy doing day to day. I think I would miss doing the research part and the psychology part, but it's an option. And then also, since I, like DJ, I also work with a faculty member who is dual hired in policy and psychology. That gives us opportunities to pursue faculty positions that might not necessarily be in departments of psychology. And that opens up some opportunities as well. So in addition to applying to faculty positions purely in social psychology, I could also look for jobs at policy schools where I would basically be doing the same thing, research, but I would be able to have more opportunities of places to apply. I think marketing, business schools, I think there's lots of options there that you can pursue too. Because the job market is pretty tough. So it's nice to try to keep your eyes open for all the different things that you can apply to.
Thank you. Mina?
Yeah, my thoughts are very similar to other people's in that my sort of nominal goal is to go for a research intensive university professorship, but like even before coming to grad school, I would go to like all the workshops and all the panel events of people who are doing non-academic things with their PhDs, whether that's in scientific communication, public outreach, or working at a like a publication or like a foundation, like reviewing grants and papers, and so I'm very much open to all the paths as I, still am sort of, on the track for academia. I'm trying to learn as much as I can from other examples. And I also am, looking to, think about how to maybe potentially collaborate with scholars elsewhere, like in my home country, in case I'm going to move back, and work there. So just also location-wide, I'm open to many opportunities.
Great, thanks. And Caden?
Yeah, a lot of what I think sort of echoes what's been said is I would like to stay in academia and work on research and do teaching, but I'm also sort of aware of the state of the job market. So I would also be interested in doing like data analysis for like autistic-led nonprofits. I'm also very interested in like doing sort of disability-focused DEI work at universities, doing something in that area. So I'm starting to explore sort of like different career paths than I thought I would be looking at when I was in undergrad and when I was applying to grad school.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think this is great to show. I think these things obviously evolve as students have sets of experiences. Grad school lets you try lots of different things, and so it can certainly tell you if you're leaning more towards a position where you do a lot of teaching and maybe less research, or the other way around, or for clinical students, they might be more interested in that trajectory of practice. And also that, we do have a good track record with students going into non-academic positions as well. And so just appreciate you all being willing to share. So thank you so much to all our panelists today, Caden, Mina, Maura, Diane, Joe, Janelle, Alexis, Shannon. This was excellent. Thank you to our attendees for joining us. I know it was a long session, but it was very packed full of information. And like I said, we will make this recording available. So hopefully folks who watch it in the future can can pause if they need to digest some of the information and come back to it. So thank you all so much. I hope everyone has a great evening, and wishing you all good health during these trying times. Thank you.